Hello, my friend. Tonight we stand in the white hush of a winter field, where the snow has stopped falling but the killing has not. The air is pale, the hedges are black. Men move like shadows through the mist, their breath rising in broken clouds, their boots sinking into mud beneath the frozen crust. Somewhere beyond the low ground, a trumpet gives a thin, tired cry. It sounds less like command than warning. Across the field, banners strain in the bitter wind. Lions, lilies, suns, boars, antelopes, and roses whip above the helmets of men who share the same language, the same saints, the same feasts, and often the same blood. Beneath those painted signs stand fathers, sons, cousins, brothers-in-law, old companions, and former wards. Some have eaten in the same halls, some have hunted in the same forests, some have prayed beside one another in candlelit chapels. Now they lift bills, swords, axes, and longbows against familiar faces. The strangest part is not the violence itself. Medieval England knew violence well. The strangest part is its intimacy. This is not a war of strangers sweeping in from a distant sea. It is a war of households. It is a war of names whispered at christenings and carved into tombs. It is a war in which inheritance becomes accusation, loyalty becomes a trap, and a family tree turns slowly into a map of graves. In the silence before the charge, men wait behind their lords. Their armour is cold against their skin. Their fingers are stiff around weapons they may have polished by the fire the night before. A young archer tastes iron in his mouth and does not know whether it is fear or blood from a bitten lip. A retainer glances at the noble standard beside him and wonders whether the man beneath it can still protect him. A knight lowers his visor, and the world becomes narrow. Then the arrows rise. They lift in dark swarms, briefly visible against the winter sky. For a moment they seem almost weightless. Then they fall. Men bend under shields. Horses scream. Shafts strike plate, mail, leather, flesh, and frozen earth. Some glance away. Some find gaps. Some vanish into bodies with a sound too small for so much consequence. One man drops without speaking. Another clutches at his throat and spins. The line tightens. The banners dip. The field begins to move. Here, in this terrible closeness, England's great quarrel becomes physical. Not parchment, not genealogy, not petitions to a king too weak to answer them. Bodies collide. Poles hook at helmets. Axes hammer at shoulders. Swords slide into joints. Men slip on churned ground made slick by snow and blood. The shouting is not grand. It is broken, hoarse, animal, and frightened. And yet above the fear there is discipline. These are not mobs alone. They are affinities, companies, and noble followings, bound by wages, favours, land, service, protection, and memory. A lord's badge sewn onto a sleeve is not merely decoration, it is a promise. It says who feeds you, who defends you in court, who may avenge you, and who may lead you to death. On this field, those promises are being tested in the most final way, somewhere near the centre. A nobleman recognises another nobleman through the confusion, perhaps by his crest, perhaps by his voice, perhaps by the shape of his household guard closing around him. There is no time for greeting, no space for mercy. The old bonds do not vanish, but they harden into something worse. A man may hate an enemy he does not know, but to kill a kinsman, he must first turn memory into necessity. This is the dark truth at the heart of the Wars of the Roses. The struggle was never only about red rose and white rose, never only about rival badges or romantic legends shaped long after the dead were buried. It was about a kingdom where the crown had become too fragile to contain ambition, where royal blood multiplied claims instead of settling them, and where noble families could not easily step away from danger without losing honour, property, influence, or survival itself. For a while, the world seems still between each wave of fighting. Smoke drifts low across the ground. A wounded horse limps without a rider. A priest mutters prayers near the rear, his hands trembling beneath his sleeves. Boys carry water and stare too long at what men become when armour is opened. The field is full of small endings, a glove in the snow, a broken spur, a ringed hand reaching for nothing. But the battle does not pause for grief. A cry runs along one flank. Someone has given way. No one knows at first whether it is retreat, trickery, panic, or betrayal. That uncertainty is deadly. Men look sideways. Captains shout. Standards wheel. In civil war, fear travels faster than command, because every man already suspects that someone near him may change sides when fortune turns. A noble family can spend generations building a name, yet in such a moment one rumour can undo it. One lord fleeing the field can condemn 100 men. One captured prince can become a bargaining piece or a corpse. One victory can require executions before nightfall. In these wars, battle did not end when weapons dropped. It continued in council chambers, in forced confessions, in confiscated estates, in attainders read aloud, in widows begging for the lands their husbands had lost with their heads. The snow keeps receiving them. Under the grey sky, the dead are not yet Lancastrian or Yorkist in any clean, distant sense. They are bodies in costly armour and bodies in patched coats. They are men who followed because they were summoned, hired, persuaded, threatened, obligated, or loyal. Some believed in a rightful king, some believed in a lord, some believed in the safety of their village if their side prevailed. Some believed only that not showing up would be more dangerous than standing in the line. The name Wars of the Roses makes the struggle sound almost ornamental, as if England tore itself apart beneath garden symbols. But the rose is too delicate an image for what happened. The reality was sharper. It smelled of wet wool, horse sweat, candle wax, blood, damp straw, and iron. It moved through noble nurseries and royal bedchambers, through parish churches and market towns, through the kitchens where servants listened for news, and the roads where messengers rode until their horses foamed, and at the centre of it all stood a question that could not be answered peacefully for long. Who had the right to rule? In a kingdom where kingship was sacred, the question was dangerous. In a kingdom where several branches of one royal family could trace their descent from the same mighty ancestor, it became explosive. Blood was supposed to secure the throne. Instead, blood made the throne bleed. As evening lowers over the battlefield, the cries grow fewer. The cold returns. Men search among the fallen with lanterns, calling names into the dark. Some hope for ransom. Some hope for recognition. Some hope not to find what they know they must find. In the half-light, victory looks less like triumph than exhaustion. The winning side has survived, but survival has given it new enemies, new widows, new debts, and new reasons to kill again. A crown may glitter in a chapel. A royal seal may hang from a document in red wax. A chronicler may later write of justice, treason, rightful descent, and noble courage. But here, where the snow is pressed flat by bodies, the truth is quieter and heavier. Families killed each other because power had entered the bloodline, and once it did, love, marriage, oath, and memory could no longer keep it contained. For now, the field lies under winter. The banners are lowered, the horses are led away, the dead keep their secrets beneath frost and mud, and England bruised but not yet finished, listens in the darkness for the next hoof beats on the road. England in the 15th century is not a large kingdom, but it feels immense when crossed on foot, by cart, or on horseback beneath a slow and changeable sky. It is an island realm of wet fields, wooded ridges, chalk downs, winding lanes, and river valleys where mist gathers in the mornings and church bells carry for miles. From the northern marches to the southern ports, from the Welsh borderlands to the flat eastern fens, the land seems stitched together by roads that are never quite safe, never quite dry and never quite free from watching eyes. At the centre stands London, restless and crowded, breathing smoke from thousands of hearths, its bridges lined with shops and houses, its wharves creak under wool, wine, fish, timber, iron, spices, and news. Bells ring from parish towers, apprentices shout in narrow streets, merchants weigh cloth in dim counting rooms, lawyers move through Westminster with bundles of parchment. At the Tower, stone walls watch the river like a warning. The city is a prize, but also a judge. No king can ignore it for long. Beyond London, the kingdom spreads into a pattern of towns, abbeys, castles, markets, forests, and noble estates. York rises in the north with its great minster and ancient walls. Coventry thrives with cloth and trade. Norwich hums with weaving. Bristol looks westward across the sea. Calais, though across the Channel, remains an English foothold, a door into Europe, and a reminder that England's ambitions have never stopped at its own shore. To control such places is to control more than stone and street. It is to control money, movement, and rumour, but distance changes everything. A royal command sent from Westminster may travel slowly through rain and mud. A sheriff may hesitate. A town may wait to see which side grows stronger. A noble lord in the north may possess more immediate power over his tenants and retainers than the king himself. The crown may claim all England, but authority must ride on tired horses, cross swollen rivers, and persuade men who already have masters close at hand. Across vast plains and folded hills, the great families hold their lands like small kingdoms within the kingdom. Their castles stand on ridges, beside rivers, above roads, and near border crossings. Some are old Norman fortresses with thick walls and cold halls. Others are newer houses softened by gardens, glass windows, painted chambers, and chapels glowing with candlelight. Yet every great residence carries the same message. Here is lordship, here is wealth, here is protection, judgment, and command. The north has its own harsh gravity. Near Scotland, war is not an old memory but a living habit. Border towers rise among rough pastures. Men there know raiding, ransom, feud, and sudden alarm. Loyalty is shaped by danger and distance. A magnate who can defend the marches gains not only gratitude, but armed dependence. Far from the softer rituals of court, power is measured by who can gather riders at short notice, and who can keep enemies outside the gate. In Wales and the marches, the landscape bends into another kind of strength. Valleys, hills, old castles, and layered lordships create a world of mixed law and memory. English authority sits beside Welsh inheritance, local custom, and the ambitions of marcher lords who have long been used to ruling with wide freedom. In such country, a royal dispute may not arrive as an abstract matter. It may arrive as a chance to settle older quarrels. The sea is another road, and sometimes the most dangerous one. Ships move from Southampton, Sandwich, Dartmouth, Bristol, Hull, Lynn, and London, carrying wool, soldiers, letters, pilgrims, and foreign whispers. Across the water lie Burgundy, France, Brittany, Flanders, Scotland, Ireland, and the wider currents of Europe. Alliances abroad can feed factions at home. An exile can become a threat again if a foreign duke offers ships. A defeated cause can wait in a harbour, watching the weather. The channel is narrow, but it is not a wall. It is a corridor. English kings had once claimed great lands in France, and the memory of those claims still clings to noble pride like smoke in wool. Men who lost fortunes in France looked homeward with sharpened hunger. Veterans returned with habits learned in long war. Captains knew how to recruit, march, fortify, and bargain. The skills of foreign battle did not disappear when the ships came home. They settled into English politics. Roads bind this world, but loosely. The Great North Road runs from London toward York and beyond, carrying merchants, messengers, officials, churchmen, and armed companies. Watling Street remembers the Romans. Pilgrims crossed the land toward Canterbury, Walsingham, and other holy places. Pack horses move salt, cloth, grain, and fish. Yet every journey has uncertainty. A broken bridge can delay news. A flooded ford can isolate a shire. A hostile lord can close a route without calling it rebellion. In market towns, people feel the kingdom through prices and rumours. Wool prices rise or fall. Coin grows scarce. A noble quarrel interrupts a fair. A band of retainers passes through and buys too much ale. A messenger changes horses at an inn and says too little, which makes his silence more frightening. A royal death, a marriage alliance, a lost battle overseas, a quarrel at council. All of it travels by voice before it becomes history. England is threaded with law, but law itself depends on power. County courts meet, juries speak, sheriffs collect, justices travel on circuit, monasteries copy charters and guard documents in chests. Yet a powerful noble can influence a verdict, protect a servant, intimidate a rival, or gather armed men while still claiming to act within custom. The line between public duty and private force is thin. Sometimes it is invisible. This is why the kingdom feels both ordered and unstable. It has churches in almost every village, written records in royal offices, coins bearing the king's image, and rituals that tell people where they belong. But beneath that order lies a landscape of overlapping loyalties. A man may owe service to his lord, obedience to his king, rent to his landlord, loyalty to his kin, reverence to his priest, and fear to whoever controls the nearest armed household. When those loyalties point in different directions, peace becomes fragile. The nobility understand this better than anyone. Their world is built from land, marriage, office, favour, and reputation. A manor in one county may be tied to a marriage claim in another. A wardship may bring income. A disputed inheritance may draw in cousins, lawyers, retainers, and priests. A seat on the royal council may decide who gains access to the king's generosity. Nothing is isolated. Every estate has roads leading into other ambitions, so the realm is small on a map, but not small in human consequence. It is dense with memory. Every county has old grievances. Every great house has a lineage. Every border has a keeper. Every road can carry a rumour faster than a royal denial. In such a world, a struggle for the crown cannot remain inside palace walls. It moves outward, into shires and ports, into castles and courts, into barns where tenants count the cost, and into chapels where noble widows pray beneath painted glass. For a while, England may appear peaceful from a distance. Fields are ploughed, ships unload, bells ring for mass, children chase geese beside village ponds, scribes sharpen quills, cloth merchants bargain beneath timbered roofs. Yet the same roads that carry wool and pilgrims can carry armies. The same castles that host feasts can store weapons. The same family marriages meant to bind the realm together can tie one household to a quarrel that spreads across the land like frost. This is the scale of the world in which families began to kill. Not endless empire, but crowded inheritance. Not empty wilderness, but a kingdom full of claims. The island has coasts, rivers, walls, markets, and laws. Yet there is not enough room for every ambition to grow safely. When the crown weakens, the whole landscape listens, and in that listening England becomes vast with danger. Who were they? These people whose names still sound like doors opening into dark stone corridors. York, Lancaster, Neville, Beaufort, Woodville, Tudor. They were not simple tribes with clean borders and separate blood. They were woven together by marriage, descent, wardship, alliance, rivalry, and old obligation. Their children played in households where future enemies might dine at the same table. Their daughters carried inheritances from one name into another. Their sons grew up learning that affection and ambition could live dangerously close. To understand their violence, one must first set aside the tidy image of two roses facing one another across a field. Real families are never so neat. A man could be born into one network, marry into another, serve a third, and be forced by fear into a fourth. Loyalty did not always follow the badge on a banner. It might follow land, gratitude, debt, resentment, or the sharp instinct for survival. Beneath every noble name lay a web of private bargains. At the centre of the question stood kingship itself. In medieval England, a king was not merely the strongest man in the realm. He was anointed with holy oil. He touched the sacred. He gave law its voice and justice its seal. He was expected to defend the kingdom, reward service, thus punish disorder, and stand above faction. Yet a king was also a son, a husband, a father, and an heir. His body was mortal. His judgment could falter. His bloodline could divide. Here lay the first unease. What happened when the king could not rule well? What happened when noble families believed they were defending the kingdom by resisting the king's advisers? What happened when a royal cousin possessed stronger energy, clearer military skill, and perhaps a better claim in blood than the man wearing the crown? These were not idle questions in a scholar's chamber. They were questions that could fill saddlebags with letters and roads with armed men. The house called Lancaster had risen from royal descent and political seizure. Its authority rested not only on ancestry, but on the success of a throne taken and then held. Lancastrian kings had worn the crown for decades, issued laws, led armies, received homage, and buried their dead in royal splendour. Habit mattered. Possession mattered. The longer a dynasty ruled, the more its rule seemed natural, even if old doubts slept beneath the ceremony. The house called York also descended from royal blood, and in some lines with a claim that could be made to look older, purer, or stronger. Such claims did not operate like modern legal formulas. They lived in memory, argument, marriage contracts, chronicles, and political need. A genealogy could be a weapon if enough powerful people chose to lift it. A family tree might look harmless in ink, until men began reading it with swords at their belts. So who were they? They were royal cousins trapped inside a system that made blood both sacred and dangerous. They belonged to a world where inheritance was destiny, but inheritance was rarely simple. A title might pass through a woman and be claimed by her son. A child might become a great lord before he could speak. A marriage might unite fortunes so immense that other nobles grew afraid. A deathbed could shift the balance of counties. Where did they come from? Not from nowhere. Their roots reached into the old Plantagenet line, into centuries of kings who had ruled England with varying degrees of brilliance, brutality, luck, and disaster. From this deep trunk grew branches, and from the branches came claims. Some branches were close to the crown, some were distant but wealthy, some had been favoured by past kings, some had been humiliated. Families remembered both generosity and insult for a very long time. How did they rise? Through land above all, land-fed households, paid retainers, built chapels, funded lawsuits, arranged marriages, purchased armour, and sustained reputation. A great lord's power could be seen in his hall at dinner, where servants carried trenchers, musicians played softly, and visitors watched how many men wore his badge. Power could also be heard in court, when a local jury hesitated before opposing one of his servants. Greatness was public, practised, and carefully displayed. They rose through offices too. A nobleman made keeper of a castle gained its walls, stores, and influence. A captaincy brought wages and followers. A place on the royal council offered access to the fountain of favour, stewardships, wardships, marriages, customs revenues, judicial appointments, and military commands all became pieces of a wider game. To be near the king was to stand near the sun. To be excluded was to feel the cold at once. And why did their world change? Because the old answer stopped working. Victories abroad faded, royal income strained, noble rivalries sharpened. The king's peace became harder to enforce. Men who expected reward found delay. Men who feared rivals sought protection from greater rivals. Local quarrels climbed upward into national politics, while national weakness seeped downward into every county. The realm did not break in a single instant. It loosened joint by joint. There is a quiet terror in such loosening. At first, people may not call it collapse. They call it a dispute. They call it misgovernment. They call it a quarrel among lords. They wait for the king to settle it, for a council to heal it, for a marriage to soften it, for a pardon to bury it. But when each settlement leaves one side feeling cheated and another feeling unsafe, peace becomes only the pause between reckonings. The family's killed because politics entered the household. A marriage could require revenge. A slain father could demand action from sons not yet ready for grief. A brother's execution could stain every feast afterward. A widow could preserve a claim in the mind of a child. A household priest might pray for the king by name while knowing that another name was spoken more warmly in the private chamber. In this world, public loyalty and private memory did not always kneel together. What did they leave behind? Not merely battles and kings. They left questions about legitimacy, propaganda, justice, and the price of noble pride. They left records of attainders, pardons, confiscations, sudden reversals, and uneasy reconciliations. They left bones found in graves and names polished by legend. They left a warning that civil war is never only fought by those who choose it most eagerly. It spreads through obligation, fear, hunger, and duty until even cautious people are pulled into its weather. The darker truth is that no single cause is enough. Not one mad king, not one ambitious duke, not one insult, not one battle. The violence grew from many pressures meeting in the same narrow chamber of history. Weak rule, competing dissent, military culture, noble over mighty power, inherited grievance, economic anxiety, and the sacred glamour of the crown all pressed together until something human gave way. And still, these people were not monsters from a distant age. They loved their children. They endowed chapels. They gave alms. They mourned their dead. They feared dishonour. They believed God watched them. Some sought peace sincerely and still prepared for war because peace without security seemed like surrender. That is what makes the story so unsettling. The killing did not require everyone to be cruel. It required enough people to believe they had no safe alternative. In the candlelight of a noble chamber, a scribe might draw out a lineage, each name connected to the next by careful lines. It would seem orderly there, controlled by ink, softened by the scratch of a quill. Yet outside that chamber, men listened for riders. Doors were barred, letters were sealed, servants whispered. The same lines that proved inheritance could also summon armies. The same blood that bound families together could divide a kingdom. To understand the broken dynasty, we must go back into the older soil of England, into a world shaped by conquest, inheritance, and memory long before the roses became symbols of fear. The land itself had taught power to settle unevenly. Rich river valleys fed abbeys and towns. Northern uplands bred hard lordships along exposed frontiers. The Welsh borderlands gave room to families who learned to rule like princes. The south and east, with their ports and farms, drew royal eyes because grain, wool, and customs money passed through them like blood through veins. England was a kingdom of old layers. Roman roads still cut across the countryside. Saxon shires still gave structure to local life. Norman castles still dominated horizons, reminders of an earlier conquest that had placed new lords above ancient communities. By the 15th century, those older wounds had become tradition, but tradition did not mean stillness. Every family that held land held it because someone, somewhere, had once won, married, inherited, bargained, or survived. Climate shaped this world in quieter ways. Seasons governed hope. A wet summer could ruin grain. A hard winter could empty barns. Disease could move through villages without caring for lineage. The memory of plague still haunted the countryside, for the great pestilence of the 14th century had torn open households, reduced populations, altered wages, and unsettled the old balance between lord and labourer. Fields that once rang with work had fallen silent. Survivors discovered that scarcity could give them power, and lords discovered that the world they had inherited could shift beneath their feet. Such changes did not immediately make civil war. History rarely moves so simply, but they changed expectations. Labourers wanted better terms. Landowners watched rents and revenues anxiously. Towns grew bolder. Merchants gained influence. Lesser gentry rose through law, marriage, and service. In the spaces left by death and disruption, ambition took root. A society that looked fixed from the outside was quietly rearranging itself. Above this changing country stood the royal house descended from the Plantagenets, a family of astonishing reach and restless energy. Its kings had ruled England for generations, but they had also looked across the sea to France. They had fought for duchies, crowns, ports, and honour. Their victories became songs. Their defeats became burdens. Their marriages tied England to continental dynasties. Their sons and brothers received titles and lands that made them useful servants of the crown, yet also possible rivals to it. The great ancestor whose shadow lay across the conflict was Edward III. In memory, he appeared as a king of chivalry, war, splendour, and success. He had many sons, and this abundance seemed at first like strength. Sons could command armies, marry heiresses, govern provinces, and extend royal power. Yet each son also founded a branch. Each branch carried royal blood. Each branch gathered lands, followers, and expectation. What appears as abundance in one century may become danger in another. From Lionel of Antwerp, John of Gaunt, Edmund of Langley, and other royal lines came the tangled claims that later generations would study with narrowed eyes. Names became arguments. Birth order became evidence. Descent through women raised questions that law, custom, and politics could not always answer peacefully. A claim might be technically strong yet politically weak. Another might be politically established yet genealogically vulnerable. In such ambiguity, power found room to breathe. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, was one of the mightiest men of his age. His descendants carried immense prestige and wealth. Through his line came the Lancastrian kings, whose rule began not with quiet succession, but with deposition. When Henry Bolingbroke took the throne from Richard II and became Henry IV, he did more than replace a king. He opened a question that ceremony could cover but not erase. Could a king be removed? Could necessity justify broken succession? Could successful rule wash away the unease of how rule began? For a time, strength answered those questions. Henry IV held the crown through struggle. Henry V transformed Lancastrian kingship into glory through war in France. His victory at Agincourt shone so brightly that it seemed to bless the dynasty with divine favour. Chroniclers could write of courage, discipline, and providence. Noble families could rally beneath a king who brought honour and spoils. The crown felt firm when victory walked beside it, but glory is a demanding inheritance. Henry V died young, leaving an infant son and an empire of claims too heavy for a child. The story of royal power became the story of absence, regency, faction, and expectation deferred. A baby could be anointed, proclaimed, and surrounded by ceremony, but he could not command great men by force of personality. Others had to rule in his name, and ruling in another man's name always invites rivalry. Meanwhile, the French war drained treasure and patience. English possessions across the Channel required soldiers, money, captains, ships, diplomacy, and luck. Each loss wounded reputation. Each demand for taxation stirred resentment. Men who had grown up on tales of triumph had to watch conquest shrink into defence. The nobility, trained for war and hungry for reward, found fewer victories to distribute among themselves. Disappointment became political. The Orcus line gathered its own strength from ancestry and marriage. Richard, Duke of York, inherited not only noble blood but vast estates and a claim that could be presented with alarming seriousness. Through one line he descended from Edmund of Langley, son of Edward III. Through another, from Lionel of Antwerp, Edward's second surviving son. That second connection mattered deeply, because it could be argued to outrank the Lancastrian descent from John of Gaunt, who was younger than Lionel. A quiet fact in a family tree became a hidden blade. Yet a claim alone does nothing unless circumstances awaken it. Many people possess noble blood without challenging crowns. The question is why a claim becomes active, why it leaves parchment and enters public life. The answer lies in the climate of mistrust created by weak rule, military failure, financial strain, court favouritism, and local disorder. When the centre falters, old possibilities become practical. Men begin to ask what they had once only remembered. The environment of power was also emotional. Nobles were raised among stories of lineage, honour, insult, loyalty, and rightful place. A slight at court could carry meaning beyond pride. It might signal exclusion from royal favour. Exclusion could mean loss of offices. Loss of offices could mean fewer resources to reward followers. Followers might drift elsewhere. A lord who seemed patient could be watching the foundations of his house erode. In this older world, geography and blood work together. A duke's estates might be scattered across counties, requiring stewards, officers, letters, and travel. A border lord might control armed men by necessity. A magnate with lands in several regions could turn private authority into national influence. England was not governed only from palaces, it was governed from halls, castles, gatehouses, abbey lodgings, and rented chambers where decisions moved by seals and messengers. All of this made the dynasty vulnerable long before open violence consumed it. The roots were deep, and they did not look poisonous at first. They looked like noble marriages, royal sons, heroic victories, lawful inheritances, and ancient offices. They looked like the normal machinery of aristocratic life. But beneath the surface, each branch of royal blood carried memory, each estate carried expectation, and each disappointment added weight to a structure already strained. The tragedy was that no one needed to invent the danger. It had been growing quietly inside the system for generations. The same customs that gave England order also gave ambitious families the tools to dispute that order. The same reverence for bloodline made rival bloodlines impossible to ignore. The same warrior culture that defended the realm gave noblemen the means to fight within it. The same past that gave kings legitimacy gave their cousins reasons to question them. By the time men began speaking openly of reform, protection, rightful counsel, and hereditary justice, the ground had been prepared by centuries. The fields, roads, castles, marriages, graves, and chronicles had all done their silent work. England's civil war was not a sudden storm from a clear sky. It was weather gathering over generations, until the air itself seemed heavy with dissent, grievance, and fate. Far from the royal chambers and noble quarrels, most people lived within a smaller circle of field, hearth, church, market, and graveyard. Their world was measured not by crowns but by seasons. Winter asked whether grain stores would last. Spring called men and women into muddy strips of land with seed baskets, hoes, and wooden ploughs. Summer bent backs beneath haymaking and harvest. Autumn brought slaughtered animals, repaired roofs, stored apples, and the long preparation for cold. In a village at dawn, life began with smoke. Thin grey lines rose from thatched roofs while hens scratched near doorways, and pigs nosed through muck. A woman stirred pottage over a fire thick with peas, oats, onions, herbs, and whatever could be spared. A child carried water from a well, careful not to spill too much on the path. Men checked tools by touch in the dimness, feeling for a cracked handle, a loose iron edge, a broken leather strap. Ordinary survival required attention. These households were not silent victims outside history. They were the deep body of the kingdom. They paid rents, owed labour, attended courts, joined parish guilds, raised sons, buried infants, repaired roads, and listened for commands that came from men far above them. Their lives were narrower than those of lords, but not empty. Each village contained memories, rivalries, jokes, debts, courtship, envy, charity, and secrets carried from one generation to the next. Family was labour as much as affection. A marriage joined hands, goods, tools, animals, strips of land, and obligations. A wife brewed ale, baked, spun, tended animals, managed children, helped in fields, and kept watch over the fragile economy of the home. A husband ploughed, sowed, mended, bargained, carried dues, and stood in local courts. Children learned by imitation. They frightened birds from grain, gathered sticks, watched sheep, fetched water, and listened to stories beside the fire when darkness filled the room. Food bound people to place: rye, barley, oats, beans, peas, leeks, cabbages, cheese, eggs, salted fish, bacon when fortunate, and ale in daily measure shaped the taste of life. White bread belonged more often to wealth. Meat-marked feast days, hospitality, or unusual luck. Hunger did not always arrive as famine. Sometimes it came quietly, in thinner pottage, smaller loaves, a goat sold too soon, or a mother pretending she had eaten. The parish church stood at the centre of both faith and time. Its bell divided days, announced danger, called people to mass, mourned the dead, and celebrated holy days. Inside, painted saints looked down through candle smoke. The rude screen separated sacred space. The smell of wax, damp stone, wool, and incense mingled beneath the rafters. People prayed not as an ornament to life, but because life was uncertain and death was close. Burial made the community visible. The graveyard gathered generations under uneven earth, near the place where the living passed each week. People hoped for prayers after death, for candles, for remembrance, for release from suffering in the next world. Wealthier villagers might leave small gifts to the church. Guilds supported members in sickness and burial. Even the poor desired a place within consecrated ground, because memory mattered, and to be forgotten was a second kind of loss. Ritual softened hardship. There were processions through fields, blessings for crops, saints' days, ale feasts, marriages with music, and winter gatherings where old tales moved through the dark. Young people flirted at wells, in harvest fields, and near churchyard gates. Markets brought colour into the week. Cloth, knives, salt, pots, ribbons, pins, fish, spices in tiny quantities, and news all appeared together, making the wider realm briefly tangible. In towns, the rhythm quickened. Streets smelled of bread ovens, tanneries, stables, open drains, fish stalls, wet timber, and dye vats. Apprentices rose early and slept hard. Artisans guarded skills through guilds. Bakers, brewers, smiths, weavers, fullers, carpenters, masons, glovers, and goldsmiths worked within systems of regulation, reputation, and competition. A townswoman might manage a shop after her husband died. A merchant might dream of sending cloth overseas. A servant might hear court news before a mayor did. Trade carried both prosperity and unease. Wool and cloth connected England to Flanders, Burgundy, Italy, and beyond. A good year could fill warehouses and purses. A disruption could make creditors impatient. Coin moving through a town gave some men confidence and others resentment. In taverns, travellers brought reports of noble quarrels, foreign defeats, taxes, pardons, and executions. Most listeners could not alter such events, but they understood that distant decisions could empty local pockets. The gentry formed a bridge between ordinary people and the great lords. In manor houses of timber, stone, or brick, lesser landowners managed estates, served as justices, arranged marriages, hunted, read legal documents, and cultivated connections. They might not sit near the throne, yet they mattered intensely. They supplied local leadership, men-at-arms, jurors, administrators, and influence. A great lord's command often reached a village through these smaller figures, who knew every family by name. For many villagers, noble politics arrived in fragments, a new badge worn by retainers, a demand for archers, a rumour that a lord had been imprisoned, a sudden order to provide carts, horses, grain, or lodging. Men did not always understand the high reasoning behind the summons, but refusal could be dangerous. To follow a lord might bring wages, food, protection, and the hope of reward. It might also bring a grave far from home. There was fear, but also calculation. A household might ask which side controlled the nearby castle, which lord held the local manor, which family had treated tenants fairly, which road was safe, and whether the king's officers could actually protect anyone. Politics in such places was practical. It lived in the question of who could punish, who could shield, who could collect, and who would remember obedience when danger passed. Women carried the strain in ways often hidden by chronicles. They kept households alive when men marched. They negotiated with creditors, protected children, hid valuables, petitioned for rights, and mourned without the luxury of stopping work. Noble women and village women lived very different lives, but both understood the vulnerability of property and bodies in unsettled times. A widow might become the guardian of memory, repeating the name of the dead until a child learned whom to love and whom to hate. Belief gave meaning, yet did not erase dread. People saw signs in weather, illness, dreams, comets, failed harvests, and sudden death. They heard sermons about sin, obedience, justice, and divine judgment. They feared disorder because disorder could feel like punishment from heaven and threat from earth at the same time. A broken kingdom was not merely political, it was spiritual weather, pressing on the mind. Still, daily life continued with stubborn force. Bread had to be baked, sheep had to be shorn, ale had to ferment, children had to be washed, scolded, fed, and taught. Fields did not wait for parliaments. Cows did not pause for dynastic claims. In this persistence, ordinary people revealed a quiet strength that grand narratives often overlook. They endured history not as an idea, but as interruption. When great families armed themselves, they did so over a living landscape filled with kitchens, barns, workshops, mills, chapels, and beds where children slept. The violence of lords did not fall into emptiness. It fell into communities already carrying grief, hope, debt, hunger, devotion, and work. Behind every banner stood thousands who never chose the quarrel, yet could not entirely escape its reach. Power in 15th century England did not live only in the crown, it lived in the hall where a great lord dined beneath painted beams, surrounded by servants, clerks, chaplains, squires, kin, guests, and men waiting for favour. It lived in the stable yard where horses stamped in straw. It lived in the buttery where ale was counted, in the wardrobe where livery cloth was stored, and in the chamber where letters were sealed at night by candlelight. A noble household was a small world of command. At its centre stood the lord, but around him gathered many layers of dependents. There were stewards, receivers, auditors, cooks, grooms, pages, priests, tutors, armourers, musicians, messengers, and armed retainers. Some served for wages, some served through family connection, some came seeking advancement, some were placed there as children, learning manners, weapons, accounts, and the delicate language of obedience. The household taught hierarchy in every gesture. Who entered first, who sat nearest the lord, who received the better cup, the finer cloth, the warmer chamber, the longer hearing. Favour could be visible in a glance, disfavour could be felt in silence. Men watched these signs carefully, because a lord's affection might lead to office, marriage, land, or protection in a lawsuit. In such a world, closeness was currency, retaining bound men to noble power through more than emotion. A lord might give a servant a yearly fee, a robe in his colours, a badge to wear, and the promise of support. In return, the retainer offered attendance, counsel, armed service, and influence in his own neighbourhood. These arrangements could be honourable and useful. They allowed administration to function into society with limited royal machinery, yet they also gave great families the ability to gather private strength with frightening speed. The badge mattered. Sewn onto a sleeve or worn on the breast, it announced belonging. A man wearing the sign of a powerful magnate entered a market, a court, or a roadside inn with borrowed authority. People noticed. Some were reassured. Others were afraid. A badge could mean protection against enemies, but it could also mean intimidation. Law might speak in the king's name. Yet a jury facing a room filled with retainers knew that parchment had to survive contact with fear. Castles and fortified houses gave this power stone walls. Not every noble residence was a grim fortress, but many could still be defended. Gatehouses controlled entry, towers surveyed roads, moats reflected grey skies, inner courts held stores, arms, horses, and men. Even a comfortable manor might become a place of refuge if trouble came. Architecture told the countryside that lordship was not merely wealth. It had teeth. Within these walls, records accumulated, charters, rentals, accounts, marriage settlements, bonds, lists of debts, letters of attorney, and grants of office were kept in chests and strong rooms. Power needed memory. A noble family had to know who owed rent, who held land, who had married whom, who had promised service, who had failed, and who could be pressured. Clerks made lordship durable. Ink could reach places where swords were not yet needed. Councils formed around the great. A magnate did not rule his interests alone. Lawyers, experienced knights, churchmen, estate officers, and trusted kin advised him. They discussed lawsuits, marriages, wardships, debts, military obligations, and petitions from tenants. They weighed which alliances were useful and which enemies were becoming too bold. The calm language of counsel could conceal fierce decisions. A letter ordering restraint might be written beside another summoning men. Authority also came through office. When a lord became constable of a castle, warden of a march, admiral of a fleet, steward of royal lands, or justice in a region, private influence and public duty blended. He could claim to serve the king while strengthening his own network. This was not always corruption. Medieval government often depended on powerful men because they possessed the resources to act. Yet dependence carried risk. A servant of the crown who became too mighty might begin to sound like an alternative centre of rule. Taxes and revenues gave muscle to ambition. Land produced rents, fines, livestock, grain, timber, and local dues. Offices brought fees. Marriages brought dowries. Wardships brought control over young heirs and their estates. War could bring wages, plunder, ransom, and royal reward. A lord with wide income could maintain a larger following, host greater feasts, lend money, fund lawsuits, and survive periods of exclusion. Wealth did not guarantee loyalty, but poverty made loyalty harder to purchase. Marriage was one of the sharpest instruments of power. Noble children were not merely beloved sons and daughters. They were carriers of land, alliance, and claim. A young girl might become the key to an estate that stretched across counties. A boy might be married to heal a feud, unite houses, or secure political support. Tenderness might grow later, but the arrangement began in calculation. At weddings, music and blessing could surround a transaction that shifted the balance of a realm. Inheritance made every family anxious. A lord with many sons had to provide for them without breaking the estate. A lord with no son faced pressure from daughters, sons-in-law, cousins, and opportunists. A child heir invited guardianship, manipulation, and contest. Death opened doors that the living had tried to keep locked. Around a sick bed, prayers might mingle with quiet anticipation. Everyone knew that a funeral could alter politics. Law promised order, yet law itself became a battlefield. Families contested titles, lands, offices, and debts through petitions, royal courts, arbitration, and parliament. A case might last years. Witnesses could be pressured. Documents could be challenged. Judges could be influenced. A man who lost in court might seek force. A man who used force might later ask the law to bless what he had taken. Violence and legality were not opposites as cleanly as modern minds might wish. Priests and religious houses also formed part of power structure. Nobles endowed chapels, founded chantries, supported monasteries, and expected prayers for their souls. A family tomb in a church proclaimed continuity. Painted glass preserved coats of arms in sacred light. Piety was sincere, but it also displayed status. To be remembered before God and neighbours was to remain present after death. Even salvation had a social geography. Early laws and royal proclamations tried to restrain private armies and unlawful maintenance. Yet enforcement depended on the very men whose influence needed limiting. The crown might condemn disorder, but it often needed magnates to keep order. This contradiction sat like a stone in the heart of English politics. To weaken the great lords too much risked leaving regions ungoverned. To empower them too much risked allowing them to govern for themselves. War abroad had trained many of these networks. Captains learned how to recruit archers, negotiate pay, move supplies, and keep discipline among armed men. When peace failed at home, these skills were ready. The men who had once expected to fight the French could be drawn into domestic quarrels. Armour did not forget its purpose. A generation accustomed to military service could turn inward when outward opportunity shrank. Beneath this surface of order lay a dangerous emotional code. Honour required response. Reputation required vigilance. A public insult could not always be ignored, because silence might look like weakness. A murdered servant, a disputed manor, a slight at court, or a broken promise could ripple through a lord's entire following. Followers expected protection. If a lord failed to defend them, why should they wear his badge? Violence could become a language of credibility. This is how families became institutions of force, not suddenly, not by pure cruelty, through habits that seemed necessary, practical, and respectable. Household service became armed loyalty. Marriage became strategy. Law became contest. Piety became memory. Office became influence. Land became leverage. The noble family was not only a group of relatives, it was a machine that fed, judged, defended, rewarded, remembered, and punished. In quiet hours, a great hall might appear peaceful. Dogs slept near the rushes. Candles trembled in iron stands. A harp played near the screen. Young pages learned how to bow, pour wine, and speak softly. Yet stored behind that calm were names, claims, debts, weapons, and obligations. A summons could change the mood in a single morning. Men would take badges from chests, horses from stalls, and bills from racks. The household would become a marching body. So the first great structures of power were not abstract ideas. They were daily systems of dependence. They entered sleeves, seals, beds, courts, kitchens, chapels, and stables. They made noble families magnificent, useful, feared, and deeply hard to control. And when the crown no longer seemed strong enough to settle their rivalries, those same structures turned inward. Carrying the weight of kinship toward the edge of war, Henry VI came to the throne as a child too small to understand the weight placed upon him. Around his cradle gathered titles, oaths, ceremonies, and expectations older than memory. Men bowed before a baby because kingship did not wait for manhood. Seals were pressed in his name. Orders were issued in his name. Prayers rose for him in churches across the kingdom. Yet the child himself knew nothing of France. Parliament, taxation, noble rivalry, or the long shadow of conquest. He inherited more than England. He inherited a claim to France, the glittering but fragile dream won by his father's sword. In royal imagery, this made him magnificent, the infant ruler of two realms, a living bridge between island and continent. In practice, it made his childhood a chamber filled with other men's ambitions, dukes, bishops, councillors, captains, and household officers gathered near the source of authority. Whoever shaped the child's world might shape the kingdom. There is a particular danger when power has a child's face. No one openly denies the king, yet everyone speaks for him. Advice becomes influence. Guardianship becomes opportunity. Rival policies appear as loyal service. A disagreement between great men can be dressed in the language of duty, each claiming to protect the young sovereign from the other. The king's silence becomes a space into which stronger voices pour themselves. As Henry grew, those around him hoped he would become the answer to the pressures gathering around the throne. England wanted a ruler who could command nobles, recover honour abroad, control expenditure, reward loyalty, and embody sacred majesty. Some kings are feared, some are loved, some are obeyed because their personality fills the room before they speak. Henry was different. He would become known not for force, but for gentleness, piety, and inwardness. He was devout in a way that seemed sincere and deep. He loved religious observance, holy learning, charity, and the quiet dignity of sacred foundations. He supported colleges and educational houses. He valued chastity, humility, prayer, and peace. In another age, in another role, such qualities might have made him beloved without danger. A saintly nobleman could be admired, a gentle monk could be revered, but a medieval king needed more than goodness. He needed command. The court around him did not sleep. It watched, adjusted, whispered, advanced, retreated, and waited. Men who wanted office studied access. Men who wanted justice framed petitions. Men who feared enemies sought protection. A king who disliked conflict could be surrounded by those who mastered it. If he hesitated, decisions still had to be made. If he forgave too readily, others might act more harshly in his name. If he trusted the wrong servant, the wound spread beyond the chamber. One of Henry's great burdens was that he did not inspire fear where fear was politically useful. Nobles did not merely need a king to bless them. They needed to believe he could punish them. They needed to believe he could judge between them with authority strong enough to end dispute. When that belief weakened, every quarrel became more dangerous. A powerful lord might obey a command because he honoured the crown. But if he suspected rivals controlled that crown, obedience became humiliation. The war in France darkened everything. English power there depended on great effort, garrisons, alliances, and the momentum of earlier victory. That momentum faded. Towns were lost. Captains argued. Money ran thin. Reports came home like cold rain. Each reversal abroad made government at home seem less blessed, less competent, less able to reward the men who had served it. Military failure is never only military. When a dynasty has built its glory upon war, Henry's marriage to Margaret of Anjou was meant to serve diplomacy, but it became another source of feeling and faction. Margaret entered England as a young queen from a world of continental politics, dignity, and courtly expectation. She was intelligent, proud, and determined to defend her husband's rights and later her child's inheritance. To some, she appeared courageous and necessary. To others, she became a focus of suspicion, especially when defeats in France and unpopular policies needed a human face. A queen in such a court walked a narrow path. If she remained quiet, she might be dismissed. If she acted, she might be accused of overreach. Margaret could not afford indifference. Her husband's gentleness created a space in which others struggled for influence, and she understood that her family's survival depended on the crown's strength. Yet every act of strength from her side could make opponents more afraid. In politics, fear often dresses itself as moral judgment. The king's household became a place where personal access mattered too much. Favourites, ministers, and noble allies rose and fell in reputation. The Duke of Suffolk, associated with royal policy in the French settlement, became hated by many who saw loss, taxation, and misrule in his shadow. His fall showed how quickly anger could gather around one man when a kingdom felt betrayed. A minister could be blamed for failures too large for any single hand. The Duke of Somerset also became a contested figure, tied to royal favour, command in France, and opposition to Richard, Duke of York. Rivalry at this level was not a private dislike. It shaped appointments, strategy, status, and the meaning of loyalty. When one man gained the king's ear, another might feel not merely disappointed but endangered. Around a weak centre, influence becomes survival. Then came a deeper and more frightening weakness. Henry suffered periods of mental collapse, moments when kingship seemed to withdraw from his living body. The language of the time could not describe such illness as modern medicine would. To his subjects, it was mysterious, alarming, and politically catastrophic. A king might be gentle and still rule through counsel, but a king who could not respond, recognize, decide, or command created a silence more dangerous than ordinary indecision. In that silence, the question of protection returned with force. Who governs when the king cannot? Who guards the realm? Who controls access to the royal person? Who decides policy? Who receives offices, pardons, lands, and commands? The king's incapacity was not only a family sorrow, it was a constitutional wound in a society without a safe, neutral mechanism strong enough to contain rival magnates who distrusted one another. Richard, Duke of York, stood near this wound. His royal descent, immense inheritance, administrative experience, and sense of grievance made him impossible to ignore. He had served in France and Ireland. He knew government, war, and noble politics. He could present himself not as a rebel, but as a reformer seeking good counsel and the removal of corrupt favourites. Such language mattered. Few men wished to say openly that they opposed the king. Many could say they opposed those who misled him. This was the tragedy of Henry's reign. His goodness did not heal the realm, because goodness without authority invited competition among those who claimed to serve him. His piety did not resolve inheritance. His mercy did not satisfy men who wanted security. His reluctance to dominate left others to struggle over domination in his presence. He did not create every problem, but his nature allowed old pressures to grow sharper around him. In a chapel, Henry may have seemed almost luminous. Candlelight would catch the embroidery of his robes. Latin prayers would rise in soft rhythm. His face might appear peaceful, withdrawn from ambition, touched by a longing for heaven rather than earthly mastery. Those near him could believe they saw holiness. Yet outside the chapel doors waited petitioners, captains, creditors, rivals, widows, and angry lords. The kingdom did not pause for contemplation. The failing crown was not a broken object lying openly on the floor. It still possessed majesty, ritual, law, and memory. People still spoke the king's name with reverence. Coins still bore royal authority. Judges still acted beneath royal commission. But within the living machinery of politics, power had become uncertain, and uncertainty is one of the most dangerous conditions a monarchy can produce. Henry VI did not look like a destroyer. He looked like a man unsuited to a violent inheritance. That was enough. Around him, stronger personalities gathered with their own fears and visions. Some wanted reform, some wanted revenge, some wanted security, some wanted access. Many believed they were preserving the realm. Under a king who could not master them, preservation began to resemble preparation for war. St Albans was not built to become a wound in England's memory. It was a market town, a place of streets, inns, gardens, church bells, and ordinary trade, lying close enough to London that news could travel there with unusual speed. Its abbey dominated the town like a stone conscience, with walls and roofs shaped by centuries of prayer. Pilgrims had come there to honour England's first martyr. Merchants had unpacked goods beneath timbered fronts. Travellers had slept under sloping roofs, thinking only of weather, horses, and the next day's road. Yet on a May morning in 1455 the town became a trap. Armed men entered its lanes not as foreign invaders, but as Englishmen drawn into a dispute that had hardened beyond words. The royal party was inside the town. Opposing lords approached from outside. The streets narrowed the choices of every commander. Once weapons were raised there, stone houses, garden walls, and gateways would turn political grievance into close and personal killing. The Duke of York came with powerful allies, including the Earls of Salisbury and Warwick. Their language was still the language of loyalty. They did not present themselves as enemies of the king. They claimed they sought access to Henry, justice against dangerous ministers, and protection for the realm from misgovernment. This mattered deeply. In medieval politics, rebellion was a terrible word. Reform sounded cleaner. Protection sounded honourable. But the steel carried by their followers told another story. Inside St Albans, the Duke of Somerset stood near the centre of royal favour and Yorkist resentment. To York and his allies, Somerset represented exclusion, failure, and threat. To the king's side, he was a noble servant of lawful authority. Around such men, judgment becomes impossible to separate from allegiance. One household's corrupt favourite is another household's necessary defender. One faction's traitor is another faction's shield. Messages passed between the sides. Words were offered, demands were made, answers came back unsatisfactory. Time thinned. Every moment of negotiation carried danger, because each side needed to appear firm before its own followers. If York withdrew without result, he might look weak. If the royal party surrendered Somerset, it might look controlled by force. Honour, fear, and public reputation pressed everyone inward until the town itself seemed to be holding its breath. The first assault did not unfold as a grand open field engagement. It began in streets and barriers, in confusion and broken lines of sight. Men pushed toward the town, meeting resistance where lanes constricted. For a time, the defenders held. The buildings seemed to assist them. Those trying to enter had to move through narrow spaces where numbers could not always be used fully. The town was not a battlefield by design, but it shaped the fight with cruel efficiency. Then Warwick found a way in. His men forced entry through gardens and houses, cutting into the town by a less expected route. Suddenly the fighting was not only at the barriers, it was within the streets. The sound changed. Steel rang close against walls. Arrows struck from short distances. Men shouted from windows and doorways. Horses struggled where there was little room to turn. A town that had been a place of shelter became a maze of fear. Imagine a shopkeeper pressing his family into the back of a house while armed men crash through the front. Imagine a servant crouching behind barrels as arrows pass through shutters. Imagine an apprentice hearing names shouted that he knows only from rumour, now attached to men bleeding in the lane. Civil war does not ask whether a street was meant for battle. It simply enters and makes the familiar strange. The king himself was caught in the violence. Henry VI, the anointed ruler whose presence should have stilled disorder, became instead a vulnerable figure amid it. He was wounded in the neck by an arrow or missile, not gravely enough to kill him, but enough to turn majesty into helpless flesh. There is a terrible symbolism in that moment. The king's body, sacred in ceremony, could still bleed in a town street while his nobles fought around him. Somerset was killed. So were other leading men of the royal party, including the Earl of Northumberland and Lord Clifford. Their deaths mattered far beyond the bodies themselves. These were not anonymous losses. They were heads of families, centres of affinity, holders of memory, honour, and obligation. When such men fell, their households did not simply grieve. They inherited purpose. Sons, brothers, retainers, and widows carried the event onward. The battle was brief, but its brevity made it sharper. A long war can numb the mind. A sudden killing shocks it awake. In a short space of time, arguments that had filled councils became corpses in the streets. The Duke of York and his allies gained control of the king, and with that control came the appearance of victory. Yet the achievement carried a hidden poison. They had won by force in the king's presence, and noble blood had been spilled in a way that could not be politely forgotten. There was still an attempt to frame the event as necessary correction rather than rebellion. The victors could say they had acted against evil advisers. They could bow before Henry, speak of loyalty, and seek formal pardon. Medieval politics had room for such careful fictions. Everyone understood that language could soften the edge of violence. But language cannot raise the dead. It cannot persuade a son that his father's death was merely administrative reform. St. Albans changed the emotional temperature of the kingdom. Before such bloodshed, rivalry could still imagine settlement. Afterward, distrust gained evidence. If one side could kill ministers in the king's company, the other could ask what law still protected them. If the deaths could be pardoned, then what value had noble safety? If armed pressure worked once, why would it not be used again? The town had answered questions no one had meant to ask aloud. The aftermath moved through England in letters, whispers, and household mourning. In one hall, black cloth might be prepared. In another, men might celebrate deliverance from hated enemies. A widow might sit beneath the arms of her husband's house, hearing the official explanations while knowing what every explanation had cost her. Young heirs would be told who had died, where, and by whose hand. The story would enter family memory not as policy, but as injury. For the Duke of York, the victory was both triumph and danger. He had shown that he could gather strength, confront the royal party, and survive. He had also shown that his opponents had reason to fear him. Fear is not passive, it organizes. Those who had once dismissed him as troublesome now saw him as capable of decisive force. A man who wins such a confrontation becomes larger, but also more exposed. For Warwick, the day added to a growing reputation for boldness. He was not yet the legendary figure later memory would shape, but St. Albans revealed the qualities that made him formidable. He could act quickly, see opportunity in confusion, and turn movement into result. In a politics of hesitant councils and slow grievances, such energy could change everything. Men followed success, and success attracted both admiration and hatred. For Henry VI, the battle deepened the tragedy of his kingship. He had not commanded events. Events had closed around him. The sacred centre had become a prize to be seized, guarded, interpreted, and used. A king who should have settled disputes had instead been captured by one. The wound to his body was minor compared with the wound to his authority. St. Albans did not destroy England in one day. Markets reopened, bells rang again, houses were repaired, blood was washed from thresholds. The abbey continued its prayers, and travellers once more passed through the town. Yet beneath restored routine lay an altered truth. The barrier between political crisis and armed encounter had been crossed. Men had discovered that noble quarrels could be decided in streets with weapons, and that afterward the world might continue. That continuation was frightening. It meant that violence did not end society at once. It could be absorbed, explained, pardoned, and remembered. It could become precedent. A battle in a market town had shown that family honour, royal weakness, An armed loyalty could meet suddenly and leave the kingdom still standing, but less innocent than it had been in the morning. In the quiet after the fighting, St. Albans returned to stone, timber, bell, and shadow. But the dead remained active in the minds of the living. Their names passed into vows, accusations, and warnings. Their absence sat at dinner tables. Their blood gave shape to future choices without needing to speak. The first great turning point had arrived not with a vast invasion, but through narrow streets where England learned how easily counsel could become killing. Momentum in civil war does not always sound like drums. Sometimes it sounds like a horse breathing hard outside an inn, a seal cracked open in a candlelit room, a whispered name carried across a marketplace. England did not fall into constant battle all at once. It moved in pulses, a gathering here, a march there, a summons sent into one county while another waited in uncertainty. Between each armed encounter lay weeks and months of watching, bargaining, fearing, and preparing. The families at the centre of the struggle had learned something dangerous. Force could change the balance of power, yet force could not easily create trust. Every settlement seemed temporary because every household kept its own memory of danger. Those who had gained influence feared losing it. Those who had lost fathers, offices, lands, or honour waited for the moment when grief could become action. In halls across the kingdom, old wounds were being dressed not for healing, but for travel. The Duke of York and his allies did not move through a simple path of rebellion. They continued to speak of good government, rightful counsel, and protection from corrupt influence. Such language allowed men to stand beneath armed banners while claiming loyalty to the king. But words became thinner as armed followings grew. When a lord arrived with thousands at his back, his petition no longer sounded like a plea. It sounded like pressure wearing a velvet glove. The Queen's party hardened in answer. Margaret of Anjou did not see York as a harmless critic of misrule. She saw a threat to her husband's authority and to the inheritance of her young son, Prince Edward. Around her gathered men who feared Yorkist dominance, and men whose kin had already died in the struggle. Their loyalty was not merely official, it was personal. In their eyes, defence of the Lancastrian crown became defence of family survival. Across the countryside, rival networks began to reveal themselves more openly. The Earl of Warwick, with his wealth, ships, popularity in London and restless energy, became one of the most formidable Yorkist powers. His estates, offices, and command of Calais gave him reach beyond that of many English lords. Calais mattered greatly. It was not only a fortress across the Channel, it was a military base, a treasury of experienced soldiers, and a doorway through which exile might return as invasion. The Nevilles and Percys brought another layer of fire, especially in the north. Their rivalry had its own history rooted in land, office, regional pride, and old competition. National politics did not erase local feuds. It gave them wider meaning. A quarrel over influence in northern counties could become part of the greater dynastic struggle, and the greater dynastic struggle could feed the bitterness of local rivalries. England's conflict was not one flame. It was many fires finding the same wind. In 1459 the tensions sharpened toward open confrontation. Yorkist forces gathered, but the Lancastrian side pressed them hard. At Blore Heath, in Staffordshire, the Earl of Salisbury found himself facing a larger royal force led by Lord Audley. The landscape itself became part of the contest, with hedges, slopes, and a brook influencing movement. Salisbury's men used position and discipline to deadly effect. Audley was killed, and the Lancastrian force was defeated. Victory gave the Yorkists confidence, but also exposed them. A battle won against forces raised in the king's name could not be treated as a minor misunderstanding. The official language of loyalty grew more strained. Armed success made negotiation harder. because each side now saw the other as capable of decisive harm. A road had opened, and it didn't lead back to innocence. Then came Ludford Bridge, where Yorkist confidence faltered. Facing the king's army near Ludlow, the Yorkist leaders found their position crumbling. Some of Warwick's Calais troops refused to fight against the king himself. That refusal mattered deeply. Men might oppose advisers, they might fight rival lords, but direct battle against the anointed sovereign still carried spiritual and emotional terror. The Yorkist army dissolved in the night, and its leaders fled. Flight transformed the story. Richard, Duke of York, went to Ireland, Warwick, Salisbury, and York's young son Edward escaped to Calais. Their enemies moved swiftly against them. Lands were seized, attainders were issued, names were stained with treason in the formal language of Parliament. A man attainted did not merely lose face. He could lose property, inheritance, legal protection, and future security for his bloodline. Punishment reached beyond the body into generations, yet exile did not end their cause, it sharpened it. In Calais, Warwick and his companions were not helpless fugitives hiding in obscurity. They held a fortified English stronghold filled with soldiers, ships, and strategic value. From there, letters could be sent, sympathies cultivated, and return prepared. England's narrow sea again became a corridor rather than a barrier. Those condemned at home could wait abroad until the wind. Money and politics favoured them. In 1460 the Yorkist lords returned. Their landing in Kent showed how deeply royal authority had weakened in places where resentment and calculation favoured them. They marched toward London and were admitted to the capital. London's support, or at least cooperation, mattered greatly. The city did not simply offer streets and walls, it offered legitimacy, money, and the sense that a political cause had national weight. When London opened, England listened. The clash at Northampton brought another dramatic reversal. The royal army stood against Yorkist forces, but treachery or shifting allegiance within the Lancastrian line helped decide the day. Lord Grey of Ruthin and his men failed to resist the Yorkists as expected, allowing them to break through. The king was captured again. Rain fell. Tents collapsed. The battlefield became a scene not only of combat, but of loyalty changing shape at the fatal moment. For York, the opportunity was immense. He returned from Ireland and made a claim that startled many. He asserted his right to the throne itself. This was no longer only a demand for better counsel. It touched the sacred centre. To many nobles and churchmen, the idea of setting aside an anointed king, however troubled, was profoundly disturbing. Yet York's claim could not be dismissed as nonsense. Blood, dissent, and political reality had met in one dangerous demand. The compromise that followed was uneasy and unnatural. Henry VI would remain king for life, but York and his heirs would succeed him, disinheriting Prince Edward. On parchment, it offered a way to avoid immediate deposition. In human terms, it was combustible. A mother was being asked to accept the loss of her son's future. A queen who had fought to protect dynastic inheritance would not quietly bless such an arrangement. The act meant peace only to those who ignored maternal fury. Margaret refused surrender. In the north, Lancastrian strength gathered with force and emotion. The families of the slain and threatened rallied behind the prince's cause. York moved to confront them and reached Sandal Castle near Wakefield. The winter air was hard. The political stakes had become deadly beyond disguise. Whatever calculations led him from safety into battle, the result was ruin. At Wakefield, York was defeated and killed. His death transformed him from claimant into martyr for his side. Salisbury was captured and executed. York's son Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was also killed. A death later memory would wrap in horror and accusation. Heads were displayed, and insult was added to death. Such acts were meant to terrify and proclaim victory. They also ensured revenge. The killing of nobles could settle one day's field, while poisoning the minds of those who survived it. Now the struggle belonged to sons as much as fathers. Edward, Earl of March, inherited his father's claim, but he brought something different to it. He was young, tall, martial, charismatic, and already capable of winning men's confidence. In the west, he defeated Lancastrian forces at Mortimer's Cross, where strange lights in the sky were interpreted as a sign of divine favour, whether halo, sundog, or miracle in the eyes of frightened men. The image mattered because armies live on meaning as well as bread. Meanwhile, the Lancastrian army moved south after victory in the north. At the Second Battle of St Albans, Warwick was defeated and Henry VI was recovered by his own side. Yet the Lancastrian advance alarmed London. Stories of northern troops and disorder travelled ahead of them. Fear in the capital became a political force. A city may not fight like a noble army, but its gates, wealth, and opinion can decide the fate of kings. Edward entered London to welcome rather than resistance. The mood had shifted. The claim that had seemed shocking in his father's mouth now found energy in his own presence and in fear of the alternative. He was proclaimed king as Edward IV. A dynasty that had ruled for decades was challenged not by theory alone, but by a young man with soldiers, allies, and the momentum of necessity. The conflict had accelerated beyond mediation. Victories no longer ended disputes. They created obligations to avenge, punish, secure, and advance. Exiles returned. Captives became prizes. Parliaments condemned and reversed. Towns calculated. Lords changed sides or were accused of doing so. Families that had once manoeuvred for influence were now bound to causes by blood already spilled. In this gathering fury, England's roads filled again with movement. Messengers rode beneath low clouds. Smiths repaired armour. Priests heard confessions. Lords counted their retainers. Mothers watched sons leave with badges sewn to coats. Every march seemed to carry not only living men, but the dead who demanded an answer. Edward IV did not become secure merely because men called him king. Proclamation was only the beginning of possession. A crown could be placed upon a young man's head. Prayers could be said. Trumpets could sound, and nobles could bend the knee. But the realm still had to be mastered road by road, office by office, memory by memory. Kingship was a daily labour. It required more than victory. It required a system strong enough to survive the morning after triumph. Edward understood the language of force. He had won men by riding with them, facing danger with them, and appearing before them as the kind of warrior King England could recognise. He was tall, confident, physically impressive, and gifted with the public ease that Henry VI had never possessed. In an age that still admired chivalric command, Edward looked like rule made flesh, yet even such presence could not govern alone. The sword could open the gate. It could not collect every rent, calm every lawsuit, or make every rival forget. The first task was to turn supporters into a ruling order. Men who had risked their lives expected reward. Estates confiscated from defeated enemies became the hard currency of loyalty. Offices were granted. Wardships were distributed. Marriages were arranged. Pardons were offered to some, while punishment fell upon others. In this pattern, mercy and severity worked together. A king who punished everyone would create endless rebellion. A king who punished no one would look weak. Parliament helped turn victory into law. Attainders named enemies as traitors, stripping them and their heirs of property and status. Restorations repaired the fortunes of friends. Acts confirmed titles, successions, and confiscations. The written word mattered because it gave a formal shape to what battle had achieved. A defeated lord did not merely lose a field. His name could be wounded in public record. His lands could pass to men who would now defend the new order because their wealth depended upon it. But legal settlement carried its own danger. Every confiscated manor created someone's gratitude and someone else's bitterness. A widow might petition in hope. A disinherited son might wait in silence. A servant might remain loyal to a fallen house. The king could redistribute land, yet he could not erase attachment. Beneath the parchment lay human memory, and memory had a habit of outliving seals. Edward also had to control the machinery of government, the chancery, exchequer, courts, council, and local commissions were not glamorous, but they held the kingdom together. Clerks copied orders, sheriffs executed writs, justices enforced peace, treasurers counted revenues with anxious care. The king's authority had to pass through all these hands. A monarch who ignored administration would soon discover that noble splendour cannot pay soldiers, maintain castles, or keep creditors patient. Money was essential. War had strained royal finances for generations. Edward needed customs revenues, especially from trade, and he needed cooperation from merchants and towns. London mattered not only as a symbolic capital, but as a lender, market, and political force. A king who cultivated the city could gain credit, supplies, and public legitimacy. He had to appear magnificent enough to inspire respect, but practical enough to negotiate with men who understood ledgers better than lineages. The wool and cloth trades remained vital. Bales, bolts, and customs dues connected royal policy to counting houses and ships. A peaceful road could fill the treasury more reliably than a glorious charge. Edward's government sought to make authority feel profitable to those who mattered commercially. Stability was not only a moral ideal, it was good business. Merchants preferred a king who could keep order, protect trade, and honour debts. Yet Edward's kingship didn't rest on bureaucratic patience alone. He knew how to display power. Royal entries, feasts, robes, ceremonies, hunting, tournaments, and carefully staged generosity all made monarchy visible. In a world without newspapers, image travelled through witnesses. Those who saw the king in splendour carried the memory home. A magnificent king seemed more rightful because the senses believed what the mind might still question. He also used marriage and household placement as instruments of rule. The royal household trained young nobles, rewarded faithful servants, and gave the king intimate access to future power brokers. To be raised near the court was to absorb its manners and expectations. To serve at the king's table in his chamber or on his council was to enter the warmth of favour. Around Edward, a new political society began to form, made from old aristocratic blood and newer men whose fortunes depended on him personally. The army keys had to be managed. England did not keep a large permanent force in the modern sense, but the crown depended on the ability to summon, pay, and direct armed men when needed. Calais provided experienced soldiers. Noble affinities remained necessary. Local commissions organised musters. The problem was delicate. Edward needed the martial strength of great lords, but he could not allow any one lord's following to become larger than royal control. The very tools of victory could become the tools of challenge. Religion gave another layer of durability. Edward presented himself as the ruler favoured by God and rightful descent. Prayers, processions, thanksgiving, and foundation gifts turned political success into sacred order. A battle won could be remembered as providence. A rival defeated could be described as judgment. The church did not simply bless kingship from outside. It helped translate power into moral meaning for a society that saw heaven and earth as closely joined. Communication remained slow, so the king's presence had to be multiplied through trusted agents. letters under the royal signet, proclamations, commissions, and commands moved outward from the court. Noble allies and loyal officials made royal will active in distant counties. A lord who received a royal instruction in the north or west didn't hear Edward's voice, but he felt the pressure of the king's seal. Government depended on the belief that such pressure had force behind it. Edward's personal style helped him in ways that written orders could not. He could charm, flatter, forgive, and overwhelm. He enjoyed pleasure, companionship, and the theatre of generosity. Men often found him easy to like when they stood near him. This mattered. A king who can turn former suspicion into personal attachment gains time, and time is precious after civil conflict. But charm is not the same as caution, and pleasure can draw a ruler toward choices that disturb carefully balanced politics. One such choice came with his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. She was a widow, beautiful, dignified, and from a family of much lower rank than foreign princesses or great dynastic brides. The marriage was secret at first, and when revealed, it startled the political world. Royal marriage was expected to serve diplomacy and noble calculation. Edward had made it personal. In doing so, he raised the Woodville family suddenly into the bright centre of power. The Woodvilles rose through marriages, offices, and royal favour. To their supporters, this was the natural fortune of the Queen's kin. To older nobles, it could look like intrusion. Court space is limited. Every new favourite stands where someone else hoped to stand. Every marriage granted to a Queen's relative closes a path for another ambitious house. Edward had built a new order, but within that order he planted fresh resentments. Still, for a time, his government gathered strength. He could command Parliament, reward servants, manage towns, cultivate magnificence, and hold the loyalty of many who valued order after years of uncertainty. His rule promised a hard lesson learned from disorder. Power had to be visible, funded, lawful, sacred, and personal all at once. A king must be warrior, judge, patron, debtor, lord, husband, and symbol. In the evening of a royal council day, one might imagine the palace settling into layers of quiet. Clerks scrape quills across parchment. Pages carry candles through corridors. Men speak softly near doorways, hoping to be noticed. Somewhere, accounts are checked, petitions sorted, letters folded, seals warmed. Beyond the walls, London continues to murmur beside the river. Beyond London, roads carry the king's decisions into the shires. This was how conquest became government, not by ending danger, but by organising victory before danger returned in another form. Edward IV's order glittered with youth, ceremony, and martial confidence, yet it rested on bargains that required constant tending. The crown had found strength again, but strength created its own shadows. In a kingdom where family, favour, law, and land could not be separated, even successful rule had to sleep lightly. At the height of Yorkist confidence, England could still dress itself in beauty. The scars of conflict didn't vanish, but they were covered by velvet, music, polished plate, and the glow of ceremony. In royal halls, candlelight trembled across tapestries showing ancient heroes, saints, lovers, forests, battles, and imagined cities more orderly than any city on earth. The court wanted to be seen as settled. It wanted to teach the eye that the kingdom had returned to grace. Splendour was never mere decoration. It was a language. A king robed in cloth of gold was not simply well dressed. He was making authority visible. A queen surrounded by ladies, jewels, embroidered sleeves, and fragrant chambers was not only living richly. She was proving that royal order could gather refinement around itself. To those invited near such magnificence, the message was clear. The crown did not merely command, it attracted. London felt the warmth of this restored confidence. Along the river, barges moved between palace, city, and noble houses. The Thames carried fish, timber, wine, fuel, wool, rumour, and ceremony. On feast days, pageants might transform the streets with painted figures, banners, music, and allegory. Children pushed forward to see. Merchants displayed loyalty in colour and expense. Civic leaders understood that honouring the king could also honour themselves. In the markets, wealth announced itself more quietly. Cloth lay folded in rich shades. Spices arrived in small precious quantities. Pepper, saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and sugar hinted at worlds beyond the narrow English horizon. Fishmongers shouted beside baskets of eels, oysters, herring, and cod. Goldsmiths worked behind guarded fronts. Booksellers, scribes, and stationers served a growing appetite for devotional texts, romances, accounts, and legal records. A kingdom at peace, even uneasily, had time to buy. Feasting turned hierarchy into performance. In a great hall, the seating arrangement revealed rank as clearly as any charter. The highest tables stood beneath canopies or near the Lord's presence. Servants carried courses of roasted meats, pies, fish, sauces, wafers, fruits, and spiced wine. Between dishes, musicians played, jesters spoke, and guests watched one another as carefully as they ate. Every cup offered and every place assigned could carry meaning, yet splendour had a nervous underside. A feast could welcome allies, but also measure them. A noble guest noticed whether he was honoured enough. A marriage negotiation might hide beneath music. A delayed invitation could sting. A gift too small could be remembered. Beneath the scent of roasted swan and sweet wine, the old arithmetic continued. Who was rising? Who was near the king? Who had been left waiting in an outer chamber? Fashion sharpened the drama of presence. Men wore gowns with full sleeves, fine belts, pointed shoes, fur linings, and jewels that caught the firelight. Women appeared in carefully shaped headdresses, rich fabrics, girdles, rings, and sleeves worked with skillful needlework. Colour mattered, texture mattered, expense mattered. To dress well at court was to enter a competition of visibility. To dress poorly was to admit distance from favour, unless humility itself was being displayed. Music gave the age its softer breath. Chapel choirs sang in carefully woven lines of sound, their voices rising into stone vaults like smoke made pure. Secular songs moved through chambers and gardens, carried by lutes, harps, shawms, and voices trained for intimacy rather than command. A listener might close his eyes and hear, for a little while, a world in balance. Beauty can be persuasive. It can also be merciful. Royal and noble chapels glittered with devotion. Candles burned before painted images. Priests performed mass for the living and the dead. Chantries promised prayers for souls who feared the long purification beyond death. Even the powerful knelt. Even kings needed mercy. In such spaces, worldly rank met spiritual vulnerability, and the same nobleman who argued fiercely over land might weep before a relic, afraid for his soul. Architecture also spoke of ambition. Palaces, castles, colleges, churches, and manor houses were improved, enlarged, decorated, and made more comfortable. Glass admitted more light into chambers. Gardens offered ordered walks, herbs, fruit trees, enclosed lawns, and places for conversation away from the public crush of the hall. The fortified world was not disappearing, but it was softening in places. Powerful people wanted security, Yet they also wanted beauty. In towns, guilds and fraternities shaped communal pride. A guild hall could display the dignity of trade almost like a noble residence. Processions moved through streets with candles, banners, liveries, and sacred images. Citizens invested in chapels, almshouses, bridges, and pageantry. Urban honour had its own codes. A mayor in ceremonial robes might not possess ancient blood, but within city walls he could command respect that even nobles understood. Women of rank lived within both privilege and constraint. Their chambers were places of management, diplomacy, piety, and memory. A noble woman supervised servants, arranged household consumption, corresponded with kin, protected dower rights, negotiated marriages, and cultivated patronage. Her embroidered work, prayer books, seals, and jewels were not trivial possessions. They formed part of her identity and authority. In a world of male warfare, women often preserved continuity. The Queen's household added another centre of influence. Ladies, servants, relatives, petitioners, and ambitious families moved around it, seeking marriage, office, favour, and protection. Court was not one place. It was several overlapping worlds, each with its own doors. A person excluded from the king's chamber might still approach power through the queen, a prince, a noble patron, or a trusted clerk. Access had many corridors. Learning and literature deepened the atmosphere of noble life. Romances told of Arthurian knights, loyal lovers, betrayals, quests, strange islands, and tests of honour. Chronicles shaped memory into moral pattern. Devotional works guided prayer. Mirrors for princes explained how rulers should behave, although rulers did not always enjoy the reflection. Books were precious objects, sometimes illuminated with gold and colour, held in the hands like small sacred rooms. The printing press was beginning to alter the future of words. William Caxton's work brought text into wider circulation, slowly changing the speed at which stories, histories, and ideas might travel. Manuscript culture did not disappear. Scribes still copied, patrons still commissioned. Yet a new technology was entering England's intellectual life, quiet at first, but filled with consequence. The written word was becoming less rare and less easily contained. Daily life at the summit of power moved between pleasure and vigilance. Hunting parties rode out through parks where deer moved between trees. Hawks sat hooded on gloved fists. Young nobles practiced arms, dance, courtesy, and conversation. Children of great houses learned the manners of command before they understood its costs. A boy might admire the gleam of armour in a gallery without yet knowing whose blood had paid for the estate that housed it. For a while the realm could seem healed because it looked healed. Ships sailed, courts met, markets rang with bargaining, royal children were born, nobles came to court in fine dress, bishops preached order, musicians played, builders raised stone. The senses wanted to believe. People are drawn to signs of stability, especially after fear. A full table can feel like proof that danger has passed, but beauty does not cancel memory. Beneath the polished vessels and painted ceilings, old names still carried unease. Some families had gained too much too quickly. Others had lost more than they could forgive. Young heirs grew up hearing careful versions of what had happened to their fathers. Servants remembered which doors had closed to them. The kingdom's magnificence was real, but it was not innocent. So the golden age of Yorkist England was not a simple age of peace. It was a bright surface laid over deep water. It gave people music, trade, ceremony, fashion, architecture, learning, and moments of genuine calm. It also showed how power tries to persuade the world that order has returned. In the glow of candles, under roofs hung with woven stories, England looked beautiful again, yet every candle casts a shadow. To the people of 15th century England, the universe was not empty space. It was ordered, watched, judged, and filled with meaning. Heaven rose above the world in unimaginable brightness. Hell waited below in heat, darkness, and terror. Between the two lay the fragile life of human beings, brief as candle flame, surrounded by angels, devils, saints, relics, omens, prayers, sins, and the promise of judgment. No one lived outside this vision. Even those who broke oaths believed oaths mattered. A king ruled within that sacred order. He was not simply a political officer chosen for skill. He was an anointed man, touched by holy ceremony and set apart from ordinary bodies. Oil, prayer, crown, ring, sword, and sceptre transformed his public meaning. To disobey him could feel like disobeying more than law. Yet this belief carried danger, because if the king was sacred, then conflict around him became morally charged. Men did not merely argue over government, they argued over God's chosen order, and yet sacred kingship did not prevent resistance. Medieval people could believe deeply in the holiness of monarchy while also believing that wicked advisers corrupted the king, that justice demanded reform, or that blood gave another prince a stronger right. This was the narrow passage through which rebellion often walked. Few wished to call themselves rebels. Many preferred to say they were rescuing the crown from evil hands. In that claim, conscience and ambition could wear the same cloak. Honour shaped the minds of nobles with equal force. A great family was not only living individuals, it was ancestors, tombs, coats of arms, lands, marriages, stories, and descendants not yet born. To lose honour was to injure the dead and endanger the unborn. A nobleman carried his lineage like invisible armour. Every public insult struck more than pride. It touched the long memory of his house. Boys of rank learned this early. They were taught to ride, hunt, speak courteously, manage servants, read signs of favour, and understand the weight of their name. They heard stories of brave ancestors, loyal service, treachery suffered, battles won, and estates preserved. They learned that courage was admired, softness could be mocked, and hesitation might invite predators. A child raised in such air did not need to be cruel to become dangerous. He only needed to believe that reputation was survival. Masculinity was tied to service and command. A man was expected to protect dependents, defend inheritance, maintain household order, and answer challenges. Mercy could be admired, but only if it came from strength. Patience could be prudent, but only until others mistook it for fear. This balance was difficult. If a lord acted too soon, he might be condemned as violent. If he waited too long, his followers might question whether he could defend them. Women lived within the same culture of blood and memory, though their weapons were often different. Noble women carried claims through marriage, preserved family alliances, raised heirs, managed estates, and shaped remembrance. A mother teaching her son about his murdered father could influence politics as surely as a captain raising troops. A widow guarding documents and lands could keep a cause alive through years of outward quiet. Inheritance often moved through female bodies, even when public command remained male. The church taught humility, charity, obedience, and repentance. But it also preserved hierarchy. Bishops sat in councils, abbots owned lands, monasteries prayed for noble patrons whose gifts enriched altars and libraries. Priests preached peace while blessing banners and hearing the confessions of men who might ride to war at dawn. This contradiction was not always experienced as hypocrisy. The world was fallen. Violence could be sinful, but it could also be framed as justice, punishment, defense, or necessity. People feared sudden death because it might leave the soul unprepared. Confession mattered. Last rites mattered. Burial in consecrated ground mattered. For soldiers and retainers, this fear walked beside courage. Before battle, a man might confess sins, hear mass, kiss a small cross, touch a charm, or ask a priest to remember him. He might fight fiercely an hour later. Faith did not make men gentle. It made the stakes eternal. Saints filled daily life with presence. St. George offered the image of martial courage under holy authority. The Virgin Mary represented mercy, protection, and intercession. Local saints, relics, pilgrimage shrines, and feast days gave each community sacred anchors. A person could ask heavenly help for childbirth, illness, lost animals, harvest, travel, or danger. The sacred was intimate. It entered kitchens, fields, sickbeds, roads, and battle lines. Education varied widely, but even limited literacy did not mean a lack of ideas. Sermons, stained glass, mystery plays, songs, stories, and public rituals taught history and morality through image and voice. People understood sin, loyalty, betrayal, kinship, divine punishment, and the turning wheel of fortune. A peasant who could not read Latin might still know that pride could be punished, that false oaths endangered the soul, and that earthly glory faded. For the educated, the past offered examples: classical heroes, biblical kings, saints, tyrants, traitors, and legendary knights gave language to present choices. A ruler could be compared to David, Solomon, Arthur, or a failed king brought low by sin. A noble opponent could be cast as Judas, Absalom, or some ancient betrayer. History was not neutral. It was a storehouse of moral mirrors, and people chose the mirror that favoured their cause. Lineage gave political ideas a bodily form. Blood was imagined as carrying right, identity, and obligation. A child could be important before he could speak because descent spoke for him. A claim could sleep in a cradle. This is one reason dynastic conflict became so merciless. To kill an adult rival might not end a claim if his son lived. To disinherit a child could feel necessary to one side and monstrous to another. Innocence did not remove political meaning. Symbols condensed these beliefs into visible signs, badges, colours, arms, collars, mottos, and seals announced belonging. They allowed men to recognise one another in crowded halls, on roads, and in battle. They also simplified complexity. A man became a boar, a bear, a ragged staff, a sun, a rose, a swan, a falcon. These signs gave memory a shape easy to love and easy to hate. The idea of justice was powerful, but justice was rarely detached from rank. A great man expected judgment worthy of his status. A poor man might fear that truth mattered less than influence. The law was respected, yet everyone knew power could bend it. This did not make law meaningless. It made control of law intensely valuable. To have the king's seal, a favourable commission, or friendly judges could feel like victory before a case began. Beneath all this lay a world-view that accepted inequality as natural, even divinely ordered. Some prayed, some fought, some worked. That simple model never fully captured reality, but it shaped expectations. Disorder frightened people because it seemed to invert the proper arrangement of the world. Yet when those at the top fought among themselves, the moral map blurred. If lords broke peace, what lesson did that teach those below? The culture of the Wars of the Roses was therefore not a mask over violence. It was one of the engines of violence. Sacred kingship made the throne worth revering and fearing. Honour made insult hard to forget. Bloodline made children political. Religion made causes feel judged by heaven. Gender roles urged men to defend name and household. Burial customs kept the dead present. Literature and sermons taught that history had moral pattern, even when men used that pattern for their own ends. In the quiet of a chapel, these forces could seem peaceful. A painted angel held a shield. A tomb showed a knight with hands folded in prayer. A noble woman's effigy lay serene beside her husband, both carved as if worldly struggle had ended in perfect calm. Candles burned, Latin murmured. Dust settled on stone. Yet those same tombs reminded the living what they owed. Memory was beautiful, but it was not always gentle. Edward IV's crown reached its brightest point not in a single ceremony, but in the slow confidence of years when opposition seemed contained and the kingdom appeared willing to breathe again. The king sat at the centre of a court that had learned how to shine around him. His enemies were dead, defeated, reconciled, or quiet. His children gave the dynasty visible promise. His government worked with a steadier hand. For many who had endured uncertainty, this was what victory was supposed to become. The royal family mattered as living proof. Sons and daughters were not private blessings only. They were political architecture. A prince in the nursery could quiet anxious minds more effectively than a statute. A royal daughter could be imagined in future alliances before she could write her name. Each birth placed another stone in the wall of dynastic security. The household of the king and queen seemed to promise that Yorkist rule would not die with one man. Edward had learned how to make kingship feel broad. He could reward noblemen without always surrendering control to them. He could draw merchants into cooperation. He could use courts, councils, financial agreements, and ceremonies to deepen obedience. He was not a remote figure hidden behind priestly mist. He was physically present, sociable, approachable when he chose, and formidable when crossed. Men remembered the warrior, but they also met the patron. The Royal Council gained importance as a place where policy took shape through experienced hands. Bishops, nobles, lawyers, household officers, and trusted servants helped carry decisions into the realm. The council was not a modern cabinet, but it allowed government to continue through discussion, paperwork, and delegated authority. In its chambers, the violence of earlier years was translated into the language of administration. Seals replaced swords, at least for a while. One of the strongest signs of Edward's maximum power was his ability to manage former enemies. A wise king could not kill every defeated opponent. He needed obedience from men whose families had once resisted him. Some were pardoned, some were restored in part, some were watched, some were bound by favour. The crown became a place where fear and hope met. To submit might bring safety. To resist might bring ruin. That balance strengthened the throne. The king's brothers formed part of this architecture and also part of its hidden danger. George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, carried royal blood, great titles, and the expectation of influence. Brothers of a king could be pillars of the dynasty. They could command regions, represent royal authority, and defend the throne in times of crisis. Yet a royal brother was never merely a servant. He was close enough to the crown to help it, and close enough to threaten it. Clarence was restless, proud, and difficult to contain. His earlier rebellion and shifting loyalties had already shown how dangerous royal kinship could become when mixed with ambition and resentment. He had tasted the possibility of power outside his brother's favour, and such memories rarely disappear completely. Reconciliation could restore a place at court, but it could not always restore trust. A brother forgiven may still feel watched. a brother watching may still feel wronged. Richard of Gloucester appeared different. He built a reputation for loyalty, military competence, and stern effectiveness, especially in the north. In that region, royal power needed a strong hand, border defence, noble rivalry, local justice, and the long reach of Scotland required a prince who could command respect. Richard became useful precisely because he could act where the king could not always be present. His strength served the crown, but it also made him a figure with his own following. The north under Richard shows how Edward's power extended through trusted family and regional lordship. Royal authority did not float evenly over the land. It needed anchors. Gloucester's affinity, offices, and presence gave the crown a sharper edge in a distant and difficult part of the realm. Men there came to know him not merely as the king's brother, but as the immediate face of power. That intimacy would matter because political loyalty often follows the hand that governs daily life. Edward also looked outward with renewed ambition. The old dream of war in France had not vanished from noble imagination. A king who could lead an expedition across the Channel might revive prestige, claim honour, and draw restless warriors into a foreign enterprise rather than domestic rivalry. Yet times had changed. Diplomacy and money could achieve what glory could not always sustain. The settlement with the French crown brought payments and prestige without the long exhaustion of conquest. Some saw such arrangements as practical wisdom. Others might have heard in them the fading echo of older martial dreams. A warrior aristocracy admired battle, but the treasury admired peace with profit. Edward's strength lay partly in understanding that a king did not always need to conquer territory to increase power. He could convert threat into pension, invasion into negotiation, and chivalric expectation into political advantage. The sword remained in sight, but the purse worked quietly beside it. Wealth flowed into royal display and royal independence. Edward sought financial methods that reduced his dependence on parliamentary taxation when possible. Loans, customs, private agreements, and careful exploitation of royal rights helped strengthen his hand. Money gave a king choices. A poor monarch must ask too often. A richer one can reward, punish, travel, build, and wait. In politics, the ability to wait is a form of power, yet maximum power often contains its own blindness. Edward's court looked secure because the king himself stood strong at its centre. His charm softened resentments, his authority controlled competition, his adult presence gave coherence to factions that might otherwise collide. The danger was that too much depended on the man. A system built around a powerful personality can seem solid until that personality is removed. Then every relationship must discover whether it was loyal to the crown, the king, the household, or its own advantage. The Woodville connection remained both support and provocation. The Queen's relatives had gained marriages and offices that tied them deeply into the royal structure. They were not outsiders anymore. They were kin to the king's children, and therefore part of the future. But noble memory is slow to accept sudden elevation. Men who had inherited greatness over generations could resent those who seemed to rise through marriage and access. The appearance of favouritism could be as politically damaging as favouritism itself. The young Prince Edward, heir to the throne, was raised partly away from the immediate centre, with his own household and council. This was normal and prudent. A future king needed training, servants, and regional familiarity. Yet it also meant that the next reign was already forming around particular people. Those who controlled the prince's environment might one day control the kingdom's doorway. In a dynastic monarchy, childhood is never politically empty. At court, confidence and fragility existed together. A tournament might display discipline, elegance, and controlled violence. A banquet might bring rival nobles into the same glittering chamber. A council meeting might settle disputes under the king's authority. From the outside, The realm seemed held, but beneath the surface lay questions no ceremony could answer fully. What happened if the king died while his heir was young? Who would guide the prince? Which relatives would be trusted? Which old grievances would wake? Edward's strongest years reveal the paradox of the Wars of the Roses. The conflict did not continue because England lacked all order. It continued because order could be rebuilt around arrangements that remained deeply personal: family, office, land, and access still mattered too much to be separated. The throne could become bright again, but brightness depended on careful shadows. Men accepted peace while calculating their place within it. For a while, confidence seemed reasonable. The king hunted, governed, feasted, negotiated, rewarded, and fathered heirs. Ships moved in English waters. The court spoke in his name. The nobility attended. The city traded. The royal image stood tall. Yet history is often most dangerous when power appears to have answered every question. Under the polish of success, unanswered questions were only waiting for the hand that held them down to grow cold. The trouble with a house built around one commanding figure is that silence can enter it like winter through an open door. Edward IV's death in April 1483 did not sound at first like the end of a dynasty. The bells rang for a king. Prayers were said. Black cloth appeared. Courtiers lowered their voices. Servants moved carefully through royal rooms where the familiar presence was suddenly missing. Yet beneath the rituals of mourning, calculation began almost at once. The heir was a boy, Edward V, old enough to have a name, a household, and a future, but not old enough to rule without powerful adults around him. His youth transformed grief into danger. A child king could unite the realm if trusted guardians managed him wisely. He could also become the prize in a struggle between those who claimed to protect him. The question was not whether the boy had royal blood. The question was who would stand nearest to that blood. Around the young king were the Woodvilles, his mother's family, whose rise had been one of the defining features of the Yorkist court. To some, they were rightful royal kin, guardians of the prince's interests, and natural defenders of Edward IV's children. To others, they were ambitious climbers who had crowded older nobles away from influence. The difference between family protection and factional control depended entirely on where one stood. Elizabeth Woodville, now Queen Mother, understood danger quickly. She had lived long enough near power to know that mourning did not stop politics. Her sons, daughters, brothers, and allies stood inside a fragile circle of inheritance. The young king's coronation needed to happen, and happen with proper ceremony, because coronation could make uncertainty harder to exploit. A crowned child might still be governed by others, but his sacred status would be sealed before the realm. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, stood far from London when his brother died, but not far from power. He was the late king's brother, an experienced commander, a leading magnate, and a man with deep authority in the north. He had been loyal to Edward in life. That loyalty gave him credibility in death. Many expected him to play a central role as protector of the young king. Yet the word protector contained an unanswered question. Protector against whom? Fear moved faster than ceremony. The Woodvilles feared exclusion or arrest if Gloucester gained control of the boy. Gloucester and his supporters feared that the Woodvilles would dominate the young king and use his name to rule the realm. Each side could claim prudence. Each side could point to past grievances. Each side could imagine the other acting first. In politics, imagined danger can be nearly as powerful as danger itself. The young Edward travelled from Ludlow toward London with his maternal uncle, Earl Rivers, and others of the Queen's Circle. The road should have led toward coronation and continuity. Instead, it led into confrontation. At Stony Stratford, Gloucester and Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, moved decisively. Rivers, Richard Grey, and Thomas Vaughan were arrested. The young king was taken into Gloucester's custody. This was the moment when protection changed shape. To Gloucester's supporters, the arrests prevented improper Woodville control and restored balance to government. To the Queen's party, they looked like seizure. The boy king was not harmed, but he was no longer freely surrounded by his mother's kin. Authority had shifted before the coronation could sanctify it. A kingdom waiting for stability received instead a sign that the old struggle for access had returned. Elizabeth Woodville fled into sanctuary at Westminster with her daughters and younger son. Richard, Duke of York. Sanctuary was sacred protection, a space where worldly force was supposed to hesitate before church privilege. Imagine the Queen Mother entering that enclosed refuge with children, servants, valuables as to documents, and fear. Behind her lay palaces, titles, and ceremonies. Around her now lay stone walls, prayers, and uncertainty. Royal motherhood had become a defensive position. London watched. London always watched. The city had seen kings enter, rebels gather, traitors die, and governments change their tone. Merchants and citizens understood that whoever controlled the king controlled the immediate future. The young Edward was lodged in the Tower, which did not yet carry only the later darkness of prison in the popular imagination. It was also a royal residence and a place of preparation before coronation. Still, stone walls can protect and confine with the same silence. Gloucester's position required speed and legitimacy. He could not appear merely as a strong uncle holding a nephew. He needed political explanation, public support, and legal shape. Councils met. Sermons were preached. Rumours thickened. The proposed coronation was delayed. Delay is never neutral in a crisis. Each postponed date invites another question. Each question invites another fear. Then the foundation shifted more violently. Claims emerged that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid because of a prior contract with another woman. If true, the children of that marriage would be illegitimate, and the young Edward would not be rightful king. Such an accusation was devastating because it did not need to defeat the boy by arms. It attacked the marriage bed from which his claim came. It turned private history into public ruin. The charge is difficult to separate from political need. In that moment, it served Gloucester perfectly. It offered a path from protectorship to kingship without openly murdering the principle of hereditary rule. If Edward IV's children were barred, Richard could appear not as usurper but as rightful heir. Yet legal reasoning could not erase the unease. The living children existed. Their faces were known. Their mother lived. Their father had ruled as king. The realm was being asked to revise reality at speed. The younger prince was brought from sanctuary to join his brother in the Tower. The gesture may have been presented as proper, even necessary, for the brothers to attend public life together. Yet from the Queen Mother's view, it must have felt like the narrowing of every escape. One son already in Gloucester's hands, another surrendered under pressure, daughters in sanctuary, allies arrested. The walls of protection grew smaller. The old Yorkist victory was now dividing within itself. Men who had once benefited from Edward IV's kingship had to decide whether to accept Richard's claim, resist it, or wait quietly. Many chose caution. Some believed the legal arguments, some feared the Woodvilles, some trusted Gloucester's record. Some simply understood that power had moved and that survival required bowing while the ground settled. Moral certainty is rare when armed authority stands nearby. Buckingham became central in the visible transfer of support. A great noble with royal connections, immense ambition, and theatrical presence. He helped present Richard's cause as the wish of the realm's leading men. Public consent, or the appearance of it, mattered deeply. A crown taken by invitation looked cleaner than a crown seized by fear. Yet appearances are fragile. Those who kneel in public may whisper in private before nightfall. Richard accepted the crown and became Richard III. The ceremony gave him sacred form, but not peace. His reign began under a shadow created by the vanished security of his nephews. The two boys in the tower became a silent question around which suspicion gathered. Their disappearance from public view was more damaging than any clear statement could have been. The unknown can haunt a throne more powerfully than accusation, because every mind fills darkness with its own image. Internal weakness had entered through the most intimate door, the royal family itself, not through invasion, not through distant rebellion, through guardianship, childhood, widowhood, unclehood, legitimacy, and fear. The Yorkist house had defeated its enemies, but it could not fully govern trust among its own members. Blood had promised continuity. Instead, blood created proximity to power, and proximity created dread. In the quiet rooms of 1483, the old question returned in a more personal form. Who was protecting whom? The uncle protecting the realm from Woodville dominance, the mother protecting her children from their uncle, the nobles protecting themselves from choosing too soon, the city protecting its trade by waiting for a victor. Beneath every claim of duty lay the same human pulse: fear of being excluded, fear of being punished, fear of being too late. The house divided because no one trusted the centre once the strong king was gone. A child inherited the crown, but adults inherited the danger. The machinery of rule still existed, with councils, seals, guards, proclamations, and coronation rites. Yet machinery cannot create love where suspicion has taken root. It cannot make an uncle harmless, a queen mother powerless, or a child king safe. By the end of that troubled summer, England had a crowned adult king instead of a crowned child. The change was swift, legal in form, and deeply unsettling in memory. The candles burned in Westminster, the robes shone, the prayers rose. But somewhere behind the ceremony, two young princes had become the still point of unease. Their silence turned victory sour, and the house that had once promised renewal now seemed to contain its own darkness. Rebellion often begins in rooms where people speak softly. A name is tested, a promise is weighed. A servant is sent through rain with a message sewn into clothing or hidden beneath harmless words. No trumpet announces the first act of defiance. In the autumn of 1483, England's unrest gathered in this quieter manner, through uneasy households, disappointed lords, frightened loyalists, and men who believed the new king's crown had been placed over too much uncertainty. Richard III had taken power with speed, but speed leaves marks. Those who accepted him did not all love him. Those who feared him did not all dare resist him. Across the south and west, noble and gentry circles began to stir. Some were linked to the Woodvilles. Some had served Edward IV and felt the displacement of his children as a wound. Some were men whose consciences, ambitions, or calculations had shifted. In civil conflict, motives rarely march in straight lines. At first, the movement may have imagined restoring Edward V, the boy whose reign had hardly begun before it vanished into custody and rumour. Yet as uncertainty deepened around the princes, the shape of resistance changed. A dead or unreachable prince cannot easily lead a rebellion. A cause needs a living centre, someone upon whom hopes can fasten. Slowly, attention turned toward a more distant figure across the sea, Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Henry Tudor was not an obvious conqueror of kingdoms. He had spent much of his life in exile, protected and watched in Brittany. Valuable because of his blood, but powerless without opportunity. His claim to the English throne came through the Beaufort line, descendants of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. once born outside marriage and later legitimized with complications that opponents could emphasize. By strict hereditary argument, many stood stronger. By political need, he became increasingly useful. This is one of history's quiet ironies. A weak claim can become powerful when stronger claims are blocked, tainted, dead, captive, or dangerous to advance. Henry's value lay not in overwhelming right, but in availability. He was old enough to lead, male, unmarried, Lancastrian enough to attract old loyalties, and distant enough to become a vessel for new hopes. His obscurity became a kind of shelter. Men could imagine in him what England lacked. The rebellion of 1483 drew in Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, a man whose shift against Richard remains one of the most intriguing turns of the age. Buckingham had helped Richard rise. Now he moved against him. Was he driven by conscience, ambition, resentment, fear, or frustrated expectation? The sources do not let us enter his soul. What matters is that a powerful noble who had stood close to the new king decided that the arrangement he had helped create no longer served him. Rain became Richard's ally. The uprising was poorly coordinated, and storms swollen with autumn water broke roads, rivers, and timing. Forces failed to meet. Messages slowed. Men hesitated. Rebellion depends on simultaneity. If one group rises too early and another too late, courage turns into exposure. Buckingham found himself isolated, his support dissolving in the wet countryside. The image is almost pitiful. A Grand Duke caught not only by politics, but by weather. He was captured and executed. His fall warned the realm that Richard could act decisively against betrayal, yet suppression did not remove the deeper problem. Many rebels escaped abroad and gathered around Henry Tudor. Exile turned defeat into preparation. In foreign courts, in rented lodgings and guarded harbours, displaced Englishmen formed a community of grievance. They shared news, complaints, hopes, and fear of returning too soon. A failed rebellion became a seed carried overseas. Richard tried to rule. This should not be forgotten. He did not simply stand as a dark figure in later legend. He issued laws, held councils, addressed justice, cultivated support, and sought to present himself as a rightful, active, and reforming king. In some regions, especially the north, he had real loyalty rooted in years of governance. Men who knew him there could see not a monster, but a lord who had defended their interests. History rarely gives one face to any ruler, yet kingship requires more than competence. It requires acceptance deep enough to survive rumour. Richard's problem was not only what he had done, but what people believed he might have done. The prince's disappearance remained an open wound. Silence around them gave enemies a weapon sharper than proof. A king can answer an accusation. He cannot easily answer a mystery that lives in every whispered conversation. Then personal grief struck Richard's own household. His only legitimate son, Edward of Middleham, died in 1484. The death of a child is always sorrowful, but for a king it also tears the fabric of succession. Richard and his queen, Anne Neville, were left without the clear heir who might secure the future. Dynastic monarchy depends on tomorrow. Without a son, the crown begins to look temporary, and temporary power invites calculation. Anne herself died in 1485, deepening the sense of fragility around the throne. Rumours followed, as rumours always do when royal households suffer loss. Some whispered about Richard's intentions toward his niece, Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. Whether such talk reflected plans, fears, or hostile invention, it revealed the political importance of her person. She carried Yorkist blood of immense value. Whoever married her could claim not only a wife, but a bridge across England's divided memory. Henry Tudor understood this. From exile, he promised to marry Elizabeth of York if he won the throne. This promise was politically brilliant. It offered a union of Lancastrian and Yorkist lines, or at least the appearance of such a union. It gave Edward IV's former supporters a reason to look toward Henry, without abandoning Yorkist sentiment entirely. It transformed him from a narrow Lancastrian claimant into a possible healer of factions. Across the Channel, diplomacy became as important as arms. Henry needed ships, money, soldiers, and permission to depart. Brittany had long sheltered him, but pressure shifted around him, and France eventually offered support useful to Richard's enemies. Foreign powers did not act from charity. England's instability was an opportunity. A claimant in exile could be a lever against a hostile king, a bargaining tool, or a useful disturbance. Domestic conflict rarely remains domestic when coasts are close. In August 1485, Henry landed at Milford Haven in Wales. The place mattered. Wales carried Tudor associations, and Henry's ancestry through his father's line gave him a language of belonging there that might encourage support. His force was not enormous, and his future depended on who joined him as he marched inland. Every mile asked a question. Would local men rise? Would nobles commit? Would fear keep them home? Would Richard crush him before hope gathered shape? Henry moved carefully through Wales and into England, collecting support but never enough to make certainty comfortable. Richard gathered a royal army. He had the advantage of kingship, central position, and military experience. Many observers might have expected him to win. He was not an old, failing monarch facing a youthful giant. He was a seasoned adult king confronting an exile with a disputed claim. The outcome was not written in the road dust. The Stanley family became the great uncertainty. Thomas Stanley and his brother William commanded significant forces, but their loyalty was famously cautious. Thomas Stanley was married to Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother, a formidable woman whose devotion to her son had endured years of danger. Yet family connection did not guarantee action. The Stanleys waited, watched, and held back. On a battlefield, hesitation can be betrayal, strategy, or survival. At Bosworth, the landscape opened into the final gamble. Men stood beneath banners in late summer air. Armour flashed. Standards mark the positions of king claimant, noble affinities, and uncertain allies. Richard's army was larger, but not all strength is counted in numbers. Trust is also a weapon, and Richard could not be certain how every force near him would behave when steel met flesh. The battle began with movement, noise, and dust. Henry's men held together under pressure, guided by commanders who understood that survival mattered more than display. Richard watched for the decisive moment. He saw Henry's standard, perhaps close enough to tempt a king who believed courage could end uncertainty in a single stroke. Then Richard made his famous charge. It was an act of tremendous personal bravery. He rode toward Henry, cutting through opposition, striking down men near the Tudor standard. For a moment, the whole future of England narrowed to a violent rush across the field. Had Richard reached Henry and killed him, the rebellion might have collapsed into flight. A crown, a dynasty, and decades of memory seemed to hang within the length of a lance. But the Stanleys moved. William Stanley's intervention on Henry's side changed the battle's balance. Richard was surrounded and killed fighting. The last English king to die in battle fell not in distant crusade or foreign conquest, but in a domestic struggle over who had the right to embody the realm. His crown, according to later tradition, was found and placed upon Henry's head. Whether the detail is exact or shaped by memory, its symbolism endured because it captured the brutal simplicity of the day. One body down, one claimant raised. Bosworth did not resolve every wound at once. No battle can. but it ended Richard's reign and gave Henry Tudor the chance to turn victory into a new dynasty. The battlefield held the familiar harvest of civil war. Broken weapons, riderless horses, men calling for water. The dead stripped, counted, remembered, misnamed, or forgotten. Those who had waited to choose now hurried to explain how they had chosen rightly. The last gamble had been decided by courage, caution, weathered loyalties, foreign support, dynastic promise, and the calculated patience of men who knew when to enter a fight. Families had killed because inheritance and fear had made neutrality dangerous. At Bosworth, the killing reached a final royal body, but the deeper question remained. Could a new crown silence the memories that had brought so many men to the field? The end of the Wars of the Roses did not arrive like a door closing cleanly. It came as a slow change in the air, a shifting of banners, marriages, laws, memories, and fears. Men who had shouted one name in battle learned to speak another in court. Houses that had once measured one another through suspicion now watched the new king with careful faces. The fields were quiet, but quiet is not the same as forgetting. England had been taught too much by blood. Henry VII understood this better than almost anyone around him. His victory gave him a crown, but not yet a settled kingdom. A battlefield could remove a rival. It could not instantly create obedience in every heart. The new king had to make his rule look ancient, rightful, inevitable, and blessed, even though everyone knew how recently fortune had turned. So he moved with caution. He dated his reign from before the battle, making those who fought against him legally traitors. It was a cold act of kingship, precise and deliberate. Then came the marriage that gave the new order its most enduring image. Henry married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, joining the red memory of Lancaster with the white memory of York. The union did not magically heal every wound, but it gave the realm a picture of healing in churches, palaces, manuscripts, and later imaginations. The Tudor rose became more than decoration. It became an argument in colour. It told England that division had been gathered into one flower. Yet beneath that flower lay unease. Some Yorkist bloodlines survived. Some noble families still remembered what had been taken. Pretenders appeared, because in a world of uncertain survival and missing princes, a name could become a weapon even when the body behind it was doubtful. Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck did not arise from emptiness. They arose because many people still believed that hidden heirs, lost sons, and rightful princes might return from shadow. The new king responded with vigilance. He watched nobles. He controlled marriages. He used bonds and recognizances to bind powerful men financially to good behaviour. He rewarded service, but not carelessly. He strengthened royal income, reduced private military independence, and made rebellion more expensive before it began. His monarchy was not the radiant chivalric kingship of old songs. It was quieter, narrower, more watchful, and deeply shaped by fear of disorder. This was one of the great legacies of the conflict. The crown learned to distrust overmighty subjects. The nobility learned that ancient blood could become a danger as well as a privilege. Families that had once raised armies from household loyalty found the space for such independence shrinking. The king's peace became more closely tied to royal surveillance, royal finance, and royal control of access. After so much civil bloodshed, magnificence alone was not enough. Government had to remember. Across the country, ordinary life continued, as it always does after the powerful finish breaking one another. Fields were ploughed again. Wool was packed again. Bells rang for marriages, baptisms, markets, funerals, and holy days. Children were born who would know the wars first as stories told by older voices beside the hearth. A A grandfather might point toward a road and say that armed men once passed there. A widow might keep a badge in a chest and never explain it fully. The ruins were not always ruins of stone. Some were ruins in inheritance. A manor changed hands and never returned. A family chapel held fewer prayers because its endowment had failed. A young woman married according to the needs of a settlement rather than affection. A child grew up carrying a surname that invited caution. In every shire, the wars left small rearrangements, quiet losses, and altered futures that no grand chronicle could completely hold. Still, the stone remains mattered. Castles stood with weathered walls and empty chambers where retainers once waited for summons. Abbeys kept tombs beneath painted glass. Parish churches preserved brasses of knights and ladies whose folded hands promised peace more perfect than anything they had known in life, in some places. The landscape itself remembered through field names, mounds, roads, and stories attached to hedges or streams. Time softened the edges, but it did not erase the shape. The dead were not silent at once. Chroniclers wrote them into meaning. Some accounts favoured York, some favoured Lancaster. Tudor writers shaped the past to make the new dynasty appear as rescue from chaos. Richard III became, in later tradition, a darkened figure around whom rumour gathered thickly. Edward IV became the splendid king whose strength had briefly steadied the realm. Henry VI became almost saintly to some, a gentle sufferer in a brutal age. Memory chose masks for the dead, but history is rarely kind to simple masks. The people of this age were not merely villains and victims, nor saints and monsters moving across a painted stage. They were men and women living inside a system where bloodline, land, honour, sacred kingship, and survival pressed against one another until private loyalty became public danger. They made choices. Some were cruel, some were cautious, some were brave, some were foolish. Many were afraid. Why did families kill each other? Because family in that world was never only love. It was inheritance, alliance, protection, office, marriage, debt, memory, and claim. A cousin could be a companion in youth and a rival in law. A brother could be support or threat. A nephew could be a child and also a future king. A mother could guard her son with tenderness and political fury. The household was warm with affection, but it was also wired into power, and power, once tied to blood, is difficult to contain. The crown made kinship dangerous because royal descent turned relatives into possibilities. The law made kinship dangerous because inheritance could pass through unexpected paths. Honour made kinship dangerous because wounds demanded answer. Fear made kinship dangerous because delay might mean ruin. When the centre of rule weakened, these forces no longer remained balanced. They pulled apart the very families that had once held the kingdom together. Yet the legacy was not only destruction. Out of the conflict came a sharper understanding of political order. The Tudors built carefully upon the wreckage, wary of noble armies and dynastic ambiguity. Royal authority became more controlled, more suspicious, and more centralised. The myth of union helped later generations imagine England as healed, even when healing was incomplete. The wars became warning, memory, and dramatic inheritance for centuries of storytelling. In the quietest sense, the Wars of the Roses left behind an image of history itself, a crown set on a cushion, a child watched by ambitious adults, a widow kneeling in sanctuary, a battlefield returning to grass, a chronicler dipping his quill into ink and choosing which name will be honoured, which condemned, which forgotten. The past is not only what happened, it is what survives being told. Now the castles are mostly still. The markets have changed. The banners have faded. The roads that carried armies carry other travellers, and the fields that received the dead turn green each spring. Beneath churches, under stones worn smooth by footsteps, lie those who once believed their cause could not be abandoned. Their voices are gone, but their choices linger in the shape of a kingdom that learned, painfully, how dangerous family power could become. For a while, the world seems still. Evening settles over England's old walls and riverbanks. Rain touches the grass where horses once gathered. A church bell moves softly through the air. The roses remain, not as simple symbols of romance, but as reminders that beauty and violence can grow from the same stem. Power passes, names fade, stone weathers, but history stays, quiet and patient, waiting beneath the surface of the land